European STS control centres had been brought online, giving the invaders a notable numbers advantage. Nevertheless, the Starleague crews weathered the storm, and at 0900 Terra Standard Time managed to destroy the last RWM warship in the area. Regrettably, this came at the cost to the SLS Enterprise and her crew, destroyed by ground-based STS batteries. SLS Theodore Logan and 5 smaller warships limped back to the Mets to conduct limited repairs, unable to provide even minor assistance to those on the ground. 2 hours later, the naval battle above Earth was over, ending in a stalemate. The half-dozen surviving SLM vessels could no longer approach the planet as more elements of the Reagan STS were brought online by Amaris's troops. The handful of RWM warships were no better off, but were at least protected by the space defense system. Many unfortunate civilian ships had been caught in the middle of the carnage. Some that were lucky enough to avoid the stray fire of capital weapons escaped towards Lunar where they regrouped. Taking on refugees was the museum ship SLS Dreadnought, one-time flagship of James McKenna, the same vessel that had put an end to the Terran Alliance and helped form the hegemony 450 years earlier. This ancient vessel led a convoy of unarmed jump ships out of the system and towards the Lyran Commonwealth. As the first day of the coup came to a close, 16 of the castles Bryan had been subjugated, leaving only the bases at Kathmandu, Mount Baker, Sandhurst and Sverdlovsk. They would become hubs of resistance in the coming weeks. Also miraculously escaping the carnage were 5 mechs of the Royal Blackwatch. The survivors coalesced around Captain Elizabeth Hazen, who was not with the rest of her unit during the attack. Together, they would form the resistance movement known as the Ghosts of the Blackwatch.
2 unique individuals within the Royal Blackwatch were the siblings Elizabeth and Lionel Hazen. The latter had been involved in an aerospace fighter accident shortly before the coup and was still recovering in hospital. As a result, neither was present at Fort Cameron during the initial strike. Lionel's location became known to the RWA soon after, and Elizabeth was powerless to prevent his murder. Though she had lost her Black Knight along with the rest of her unit, she knew the location of a hidden cache at the Monongahela Heya River. The former captain of the Balaklava Company made her way there, and using a specially outfitted command Highlander, was able to re-establish contact with the few Blackwatch survivors. She would use her experience to lead her new Ghost resistance cell, and became one of the largest thorns in Amaris's side during his occupation.
One key installation that had escaped destruction was at Hilton Head. Unbeknownst to Amaris, a 3rd HPG station had been under construction. It was still years from completion, but there was a chance it would prove vital in re-establishing contact with the inner sphere. Those workers who didn't flee immediately did what they could to mothball and obscure the facility's purpose. The Citadel was the last structure at Unity City still under SLDF control. Repeated assaults against the facility had been turned back, giving those inside time to sanitize all classified information held within. Even a second nuclear strike did not succeed in destroying the monolith. Amaris eventually had to call in his last surviving warships to conduct an hour-long orbital bombardment, an act which threw vast amounts of radioactive material up into the atmosphere, turning the Puget Sound region into one of the most heavily irradiated areas on Earth. At 1800 Terra Standard Time, Stefan Amaris addressed the planet from the Royal Palace. Standing at his side were several key nobles and politicians, and behind them, the crest of the Starleague had been replaced by that of House Amaris. The Rimworld's president declared that he had ended the tyranny of the Cameron dictators and returned the hegemony to its people. This did little to mollify the still fighting SLDF, however. The royal court from which he made the address had been the epicenter of Operation Apotheosis. 25 hours earlier, he had strode into the audience chamber in the embrace of Richard Cameron. Amaris had held the gifted laser pistol aloft, admiring its artistry like the brilliance of his own plan, then lowered the barrel to the First Lord's head. The 2 men smiled at each other, Richard nervously, Amaris monstrously. And then, he pulled the trigger. As his officers gunned down the Cameron bodyguard, and the city outside erupted into chaos, Stefan Amaris seated himself on the throne of the Starleague, and looked down at the headless corpse of his friend the First Lord. "Clean up that unsightly mess," he ordered once the room was secured. The Amaris coup had been a success, and the Starleague civil war had begun. In the aftermath of the Amaris coup, confusion reigned across the Star League. The Terran hegemony was under heavy assault, though everyone beyond its borders was in the dark about this. The surgical strikes against the HBG stations and the capture of all system jump points prevented word of Operation Apotheosis getting out, giving the Rimworld's aggressors the vital time they needed to eliminate the few pockets of resistance. In the previous chapter, we looked at the first day of the Battle for Terra, but similar attacks began at H-hour across the hegemony. By the end of 2766, the Rimworld's army had moved to occupy over half of the castles Brian within the realm, which put them in a very strong position before the first shot was even fired. Add to this the many friendly governments and nobility who were eager to switch sides. It's not surprising the RWA were able to secure 95 worlds within the first 24 hours. Not all would go down without a fight, however, particularly those housing sizable SLDF garrisons. General Scoffins had identified many of those who would prove more stubborn ahead of time, and assigned a larger complement of troops to tackle the problem. In most cases, it was just a matter of time. However, there were several unexpected stumbling blocks along the way. One of those where things had gone awry was Dayron. The heads up from space had given Major General Anika Telman time to seal the castle's Brian ahead of H-hour. As one of the Star League Defense Force's 5 regional HQs, this was a major problem for the RWA. Another world where the capture of the HBG had been thwarted was Kaf. The SLDF commandos fought for almost a day before they were ordered to stand down by Duchess Misha Confalanieri, an Amaris sympathizer. They withdrew into the wilderness rather than surrender. New Dallas was one of the few outright victories for the SLDF. Having failed to capture the HBG intact, General Bembardo had withdrawn what was left of the 62nd Republican Guard Brigade into Fort Resolute and called in 8 RWM warships overhead to provide assistance. Unfortunately for them, the SLDF had also secured the SDS stations, and the Navy soon found themselves fighting for their lives against the many defense drones. On the ground, Major General Carlos Cataga launched an offensive, ultimately routing the periphery forces. Bembardo was killed in the battle, her dragoons fighting to the last man. Within 6 hours, New Dallas was secure, but it had come at a heavy cost. Carver 5 saw intense fighting between the two sides. The main SLDF stronghold was the Quantico Island Fortress, training center for all Can Marine forces within the regular army. As H-hour approached, the small Rimworld's aerospace complement based at Quantico began launch procedures. They were grounded at the last moment when Colonel Koji Icho, the base's space traffic control manager, noticed a rapidly approaching squadron of RWA fighters on radar. Knowing full well that their allied pilots were equipped with nuclear weapons and had every intention of dropping them on the base, the Rimworld's fighters began lining up for takeoff regardless. This triggered a bizarre skirmish between the aerospace pilots on both sides, where landed or taxiing craft engaged each other on the ground, as did the handful of mechs present. The Star League won the engagement and raced to intercept the approaching bogies. Sadly, a number broke through, and in the opening minutes of the coup, 4 nuclear detonations rocked the island and the city. They failed to eliminate the fortified base, however. Over the next few days, General Sol van der Kolk's Can Marines secured Quantico, whereas his counterpart, General Noriko Milton Davis, took control of the rest of the planet's many island continents. This standoff would ultimately last into the next decade. The elimination of SLDF High Command was a priority target for the RWA. Director of Special Forces Command Koji Telasco had been visiting Sabik when the coup began. Despite nuclear strikes on the Harsh Terrain Test Center and the Special Armed Services Training Center, the SAS forces survived. Telasco led his commandos to victory against the invaders in just a few days. But as the general closed in for the kill, the RWA looted the supply depots, destroyed the HBG and all jump ships in system, and then left, ensuring that those on Sabik were trapped. While Telasco may have survived the coup, he could no longer challenge Amaris. Though he saved the lives of many on the ground, he would eventually succumb to radiation poisoning in the coming years. The Rimworlders undertook a similar strategy at Sirius, merely raiding the mining colony of its valuable materials, blasting the orbital stations into oblivion, and leaving the survivors to fend for themselves on the volcanic surface. Back in orbit over Terra, the SLN succeeded in launching a precision strike against the last RimWorld's warship in orbit. They had less than a day to celebrate this victory, however, as Amaris began to consolidate his remaining fleet assets within the Terran system above Earth. Late on the 29th, they launched an assault against the Met's orbital defense station, and the last of the SLN presence was destroyed. Ultimately, only 4 of the warships Amaris deployed to Terra survived apotheosis, all heavily damaged.
Amaris' victory on Terra was near absolute, achieved through years of careful planning by his officers and soldiers. But in the days following the coup, Amaris became aware just how tenuous his hold over the planet was. With so many of his warships needed to secure the jump points along the hegemony border, the space battle over Earth had been won only by the narrowest of margins. Of the 84 Star League warships that were within the hegemony during the attack, 31 had escaped to unknown systems. Were they to suddenly materialize in orbit, they would create a blockade around Terra Amaris would be unable to break. Unfortunately for the SLDF, it would take too long for the isolated survivors to regroup, by which time Amaris had brought online enough of the Regan SDS to secure his holdings. Were it not for the complete takeover of the HPG communications network, it's possible that the fabled Star League Civil War would have lasted less than a month.
The capture of the Ian Cameron shipyards allowed them to bring the craft there into active duty, and over time another few hundred of the more serviceable craft from the reserve fleet were pressed into action, replacing most of their losses, albeit with old and inferior designs. Other naval yards were secured quickly during the coup, though they would have some trouble with the massive Omicron II facility at Keed, when the workers on board decoupled the various wings and arms and sent them cartwheeling into space. By December 30th, 135 planets within the hegemony were now under RimWorld's control. Amaris broadcasted a message to the conquered worlds. In it, he downplayed the hostilities and pushed the idea that he had liberated them from the oppression of House Cameron. Stefan had grand plans for the hegemony, and winning their support was vital. While Amaris and his schemers were working to alter the face of the inner sphere, General Scoffins set about surgically crushing the remaining opposition. Some were relatively easy to deal with, such as the resistance on Bryant. They had used their storm inhibitor array as a defensive weapon to pin down RimWorld's troops and damage naval units. The destruction of these colossal orbital mirrors brought a swift end to proceedings in early January. The defence of Northwind fell not to the SLDF, but to the 5 Highlander mercenary regiments. Because they had not been involved in the Periphery Uprising, the planet was one of the most heavily defended at the time of the coup. Scoffins had accounted for this in advance, deploying a large contingent of forces which crushed the Northwind Highlanders within the first week. Meanwhile, the SLS Dreadnought, which had been steadily jumping towards Lyran space, was intercepted at Wyatt in mid-January. The ancient warship made a heroic last stand to buy time for the civilian vessels to make their final jump into the Commonwealth, though the ship with which McKenna had forged the hegemony some 450 years earlier was lost with all hands. The commandos on CAF had resurfaced after a few days and begun a guerrilla campaign against the occupiers. This ended quickly when Colonel Orestes Tomasevi disabled the energy barriers keeping the planet's dinosaur wildlife away from the civilian population, in retribution for harbouring the SLDF. On the 27th of January, the Colonel reported to Amaris that the world was secure, though in reality the commandos were just in hiding. New Dallas, which had survived the initial assaults, now faced a new threat when Admiral Otto Idowu aboard the RWS Tiger Shark arrived in system. He moved his 30 warship flotilla from the jump points into orbit, destroying the last of the world's STS on January 14th. He gave the planet 24 hours to surrender. Governor Titus Clay and Major General Kataga ordered their aerospace assets to fight, but it proved a futile gesture. The orbital bombardments began the next day and continued unabated for 16 days until fresh RimWorld's troops arrived on the 31st, by which time Kataga and his New Dallas Rangers were annihilated within Fort Goliad. But even the execution of Governor Clay didn't completely eradicate the guerrilla resistance, and New Dallas would continue on as a thorn in the RWA's side. The troublesome Castles Bryan were Scoffin's primary targets during this period. The Sandhurst base was effectively isolated when RWA reinforcements redeployed to Britain and surrounded the complex, occupying the base by the end of the month. This relatively bloodless victory was the exception though. around the same time, the survivors at the War Academy on Mars were overwhelmed after 6 weeks of bitter fighting. The 141st Amaris Dragoons, who had been besieging Mount Baker, were reassigned to CAF. That world had been declared for Amaris on the first day, but the 3378th and the 3381st Special Forces battalions continued to fight. The 118th Dragoons and Salazar's Irregulars had been unable to locate the battalions, but the arrival of the 141st helped eliminate the majority of the SAS. The few survivors went on to found the planet's large resistance movement. The 5 Army Group headquarters worlds each possessed at least one Castle Bryan still under SLDF control, as did half a dozen others. Successive nuclear and orbital strikes over the course of several months finally cracked these facilities and cemented Amaris' rule. Likewise, the bases at Mount Baker and Sverdlovsk were overcome in this manner. Only Kathmandu's construction deep underground prevented a similar fate, and incredibly, would continue to resist for over a year. The destruction of these last bases marked the end of First Corps. A mere 8% of the premier First Army had survived the Periphery Uprising and Amaris coup, and most of those fell the following year. All ground resistance from this point on was in the form of partisan and irregular units, sometimes led by former SLDF officers. Achieving this victory had come at a not insignificant cost to the Rimworld's army. More than 50 regiments had been destroyed, about a quarter of their strength. Furthermore, their navy had been reduced to less than half its former size.
An essential part of Amaris' plans to capture the Terran hegemony was taking control of the space lanes. To do this, he would need to construct the largest fleet of any house save the Star League Navy itself. Those ships built by the Rimworld's Republic were put together so rapidly that quality control fell by the wayside, many entering service with all manner of defects. He cajoled Richard Cameron into allowing him to crew over 100 of the mothballed reserve fleet while secretly acquiring the codes to launch 100 more moments before the coup. At a time when the member states were each fielding around 50 vessels, with as many older craft being mothballed, Amaris made his move with a fleet of well over 300, 4 times as many warships as the Star League had on hand. Yet despite this advantage, the dogged defense of the SLN coupled with losses sustained to the space defense systems resulted in the destruction of more than half of his armada. The worst casualties were suffered at Terra, including the loss of all 3 brand new Stefan Amaris-class battleships, along with the head of the Rimworld's Navy, Admiral Geoffrey Cotier. Stefan dispatched urgent messages back to the Rimworld's Republic to hurry completion of the next 2 hulls in the class, RWS Gregory and Terran's Amaris.
Also targeted during Operation Apotheosis were the shared planets along the border of the hegemony. RWA troops deployed to each and were able to eliminate the small member state garrisons. The exception to this was Tikhonov, where Hamilton's Highlanders and Justinia's Cuirassiers fought doggedly to hold on to the key industrial world and commonality capital. These conquests were one of the very few occasions that the Rimworlders faced off against a foe other than the SLDF. Amaris intended to return full control to the other realms, as a reward for acknowledging him as the new leader of the Star League. The near-complete subjugation of the realm did not mark the end of the Star League's operations within the hegemony though. In late January, SLS Kharkov and Wales reached the hidden deep space facility in the Lytton 6828 system, known only to the most senior admirals. There, the directors of JAG and RepDep Command met the Deputy Director of Naval Command, Admiral Vincenzo McTiernan. The existence of this base remained a closely guarded secret throughout the war, but it would become the center of resistance efforts within the hegemony. The surviving members of High Command ordered the deconstruction and reassembly of several recharge and refueling stations, including the Apollo 4 shipyards, to a pair of uncolonized systems. Known as Freedom and Liberty stations, they were havens for those fleeing the war, as well as staging posts for the so-called secret fleet. One of the most pressing concerns for the Rimworlders was that so far only 6 of the space defense systems were under their control, and one had been completely destroyed at New Dallas during the coup. They needed a way to reinforce their shattered fleet and stop the secret fleet from operating within the hegemony. While the SLDF was still frozen out in the periphery, the RWA struck first at the Lyran worlds of Nusakan and Zabeb al-Ghanubi. The two planets were a contentious issue between the Commonwealth and the hegemony, a shared ownership arrangement having never been established. Officially, they belonged to House Steiner, but the strong Star League presence meant that in reality they answered to the Camerons. Both had been instrumental in the development of the SDS. An SLDF Battlemech division was stationed within the 3 Castles Bryan of Nusakan. 2 of those facilities came under surprise assault and were overrun in the weeks following the coup. Fort Romas fought on throughout 2767, but was eventually overwhelmed. Thousands of officers were dispatched to the Alsop Robotics headquarters on Zabebel Ganubi to train in the operation of SDSs, though bringing them online was a long, slow process. Amaris's primary concern in January 2767 was legitimizing his hostile takeover of the hegemony. Many planetary governors and nobility had given their support, some willingly, others through bribes or coercion, but he needed similar approval from the common citizens. Most were as unenthusiastic about Cameron as the upper classes, but feared new leadership under the usurper. The Rimwell's president's public image during this period was carefully crafted by Samir and Jari to belay those fears. Stefan played on the dislike of the Cameron family and claimed that the SLDF was trying to restore that ignominious house to power. He also promised an increase in cooperation between realms, something that had fallen off sharply in recent years. Lastly, he made demonstrations out of those individuals within the RWA who had brought about civilian casualties, often as justification to remove problem officers, such as General Tolston Yukai, who was replaced as military governor on Dayron by January 10th and publicly executed on the 28th.
Despite the grandiose name given to the Rimworld's Operation Apotheosis, Stefan Amaris didn't see himself as a god. It was more of an inside joke that started within his inner circle that eventually became real. But if he was a god, he was a generous one, at least as far as his own military was concerned. In the months following the coup, those units that had performed well were greatly rewarded. The 4th Amaris Dragoons had achieved victory over the Royal Black Watch and were expanded into a full brigade, now back under the command of Colonel Zat Dag, following Armstrong Duquette's self-imposed nuclear injury. Likewise, the Green Haven Gestapo, whose timely arrival had won the day at Geneva, were also expanded. However, those who had not pleased him soon found themselves facing down the barrel of a gun. Rimworld's Army General Tolston Yukai, the man Amaris' own propaganda was now calling the Butcher of Dairon, became a scapegoat for all the overzealous commanders who had created more carnage than Stefan found tolerable. Of course, the death toll mattered far less to Amaris than the damage to his political optics.
To win lasting support though, Amaris chose to hold an election that would decide the next Director General. The usurper needed to ensure that the outcome of this democratic vote went in his favour. His primary opponent during the election campaign was Count Frederick Oldenhoff, President of the Terran Congress, a man carefully chosen as having little public appeal. Others who stepped forward were soon given reasons to withdraw from the running. The main concern was any Cameron claimants to the throne. As per the Star League Accord signed 2 centuries earlier, only a member of House Cameron could serve as First Lord. As long as that family remained, they would provide a rallying point for opposition. Amaris didn't flinch from the only solution to this problem. Most of the royal family had been at Unity City for the Christmas celebrations and were now prisoners. Over the next few weeks, others were rounded up from across the hegemony until 79 were being held prisoner at the court of the Star League. The city itself had been further marred by several cataclysmic landslides. The nuclear fire had charred the surrounding hills to bare black earth, and when the torrential rain started days later, a third of the city had been swept away, killing thousands more. The rain continued for weeks, a lament for the dead First Lord. On January 21st, the Camerons were gathered in the throne room and presented with Amaris' demands. Renounce their family name and swear fealty, or refuse and be executed. First to step forward was Elise Graham, Richard's wife. She carried their daughter Amanda in her arms. Elise refused and told Amaris he would need to kill them both. Inspired by her defiance, many more refused, including Richard's sisters, Elizabeth and Helena, the latter of whom was also rumoured to be pregnant. The 21st to step forward, Jason Cameron Bashina, was the first to kneel. At that moment, Stefan Amaris revealed his true sadistic nature. He drew the laser pistol with which he had killed Richard and shot Jason dead. Realising their fate was sealed regardless, the family attempted to rush the throne, but were gunned down by Stefan's guards. In the aftermath of the throne room massacre, Amaris ordered the chamber sealed, a tomb for the once mighty Great House. All this, of course, was hidden from the public. It was said that the Cameron family had accepted exile and left the hegemony. The pragmatic worldview of the neo-chivalristic state actually accepted this, understanding that Amaris could never allow them to remain to press their claim. Though the First Lord's fate remained a mystery for the moment, in time, stories were told about Richard's refusal to step down, about it was he who drew the weapon and attempted to kill Amaris before being overpowered and shot by the Rimwell's president. That title would soon prove to be an afterthought to Stefan Amaris. On January 28th, approximately 70% of the voting populace elected him as the 21st Director General of the Terran hegemony, the first non-Cameron since James McKenna. This was confirmed 2 days later by the hegemony government with a majority of 63%, the necessary backing whipped up by his ally Philippa Dante. In exchange for her fervent support, the Terran Congress presidency passed from Count Oldenhoff to herself. The fact that less than 10% of the electorate had voted mattered little to the end result. All the evidence that pointed to tampering with the election was swiftly swept under the rug by the BSLA, an organisation that was de facto controlled by Amaris' ally Outerbridge.
The democratic election held for the hegemony's next Director General is an interesting historical point. Exactly how much credence should be placed in it? A violent military takeover had taken place just 1 month earlier and was still taking place on some worlds, and yet now people were expected to go out and vote. Their choice of candidates was also severely restricted. Somji Berku, a member of the Terran High Council, withdrew after accusations of embezzlement, the irony being that no man alive was as guilty of said crime as Stefan Amaris. Another counselor, Atrisha Kisabaka, gracefully dropped out of the running to focus on her family, the same family which Amaris' goons had just thrown in an African gulag. Jens Pinera, the Director General during Simon Cameron's reign and throughout his son Richard's regency, wanted nothing to do with the new government and retired into obscurity. Terra also had a rocky history with democracies in general, the ancient Terran alliance having nearly resulted in another world war before James McKenna stepped in to forcefully resolve the situation. And yet, despite all this blatant manipulation, it cannot be denied that Amaris had significant support among the hegemony's people and had a realistic chance of being elected anyway.
On January 31st, the time had come to reveal to the galaxy what had transpired. Amaris issued an address to the hegemony and wider inner sphere, proclaiming the dawn of a new era. Sidestepping the legal issue of the Starling Accords, which he knew his opponents would use against him, Stefan boldly overcame the problem by declaring the formation of a new interstellar state, the Amaris Empire. This was the first message to leave the core worlds since the HBG blackout. It quickly propagated across all known space and sent tidal waves through the political and economic spheres. Shock would be a tremendous understatement in describing how this announcement was received. The leaders of the member and territorial states, who each received a personal message in the days after, were dumbfounded by the sudden usurpation. Each was commanded to recognize Amaris as their new emperor. None did. The man who took it the hardest was coordinator Takiro Kirita. The emperor's message revealed that his grandnephew Drago and his family were alive and well, and hostages in all but name. Takiro was distraught at this news and fretted constantly for several days. Soon after, he collapsed. On his deathbed, he made his son Minoru swear that he would work peacefully with Amaris to ensure Drago's safe return. Takiro died aged 121. The SLDF at large was still fighting against the Periphery Uprising, but their advance soon ground to a halt once the Starleague banks defaulted on their payments. The news reached Commanding General Alexander Kerensky on February 4th. Some reports say the general was so stunned that he shut down completely. He seemed disbelieving at first and requested confirmation from those close to home. Nobody sent into the hegemony returned. The Chevalier stepped in meantime and ordered all SLDF HPG traffic be rerouted around the hegemony to prevent interception by Amaris. New ciphers were dispatched by courier, but this put a pause on all operations until they were delivered. The SLN's 12th Fleet was dispatched to their old stations in the Rimworlds to begin gathering intelligence on how much of the RWA remained, and by extension, how much had been deployed to the hegemony. The loss of the prime communications circuit, a network of more powerful relays that used the hegemony as its central hub, was a significant blow to their operations. Only the actions of Jerome Blake, now de facto head of the Department of Communications, made it possible for the remaining HPGs to handle the increased workload.
Any discussion of Jerome Blake's activities during the Star League Civil War risks conflating the man he was then to the man he would become. There is not a soul alive in the 31st century who has not heard of Comstar's sainted founder. Back in 2767, though, he was merely a chief technical operations officer for the HPG on Oliver. Born and raised near the Great Lakes in North America, Blake demonstrated himself to be a technical savant in his childhood. At the age of 16, he graduated from the University of Lambrecht with a degree in hyperspatial mathematics and applied physics. When Amaris launched his coup, Jerome was away vacationing in the Free Worlds League. By the time the dust had settled, it was discovered that he was the most senior member of the Star League Bureau of Communications to escape from the Terran hegemony lockdown. Tasked with establishing alternate routes for HPG communications around the compromised Terran hegemony, Blake's amazing success at the task won him instant approval among the SLDF, as well as endearing him to the Council Lords who were suffering their own disruption from the Amaris takeover.
A ceasefire was called for on all fronts in February, something that the retreating periphery forces were glad for. The SLDF waited to see what Kerensky would do, as did the Council Lords, who asked the Commanding General to declare his intentions. One of the most significant effects of the Amaris coup was the near collapse of the Innisphere economy. The damage caused by the HPG blackout cannot be overstated. Across all the realms, businesses were in crisis. With no trade going in or out of the hegemony, even those nations who had spent the past decades distancing themselves from the League were hit hard. Trade between member states kept the better prepared afloat, but nobody escaped unscathed. As the economic freefall continued, it created a situation where the use of arms to seize raw materials became almost a necessity. Fear of SLDF retribution was the only thing that kept the State Lords from launching massive raids against their neighbours to claim resources for themselves. Neither the Star League nor the Amaris Empire was in any position to police such actions, of course. Come February, they were both in ruinous financial situations and were racing to secure new funding. One source of wealth for Amaris was the seizure of the enormous fortunes of the Vatican Church. Under the command of General Legos, the Greenhaven Gestapo arrested the Pope after he refused to sell out his fellow cardinals. Other religious groups were similarly persecuted. In time, Antelos would make Italy his personal fief. Another two of Amaris' priority targets during the coup had been the capture of the Talitha and Zolokofan exchanges and mints. These would go some way to repaying those companies that had helped finance the secret army. Many businesses were becoming increasingly tied to the new government, sometimes unwillingly, with the success or failure of Amaris' takeover going on to mirror their own fate. They soon found themselves in a situation where their continual support was the only way to remain afloat. To withdraw it risked the assets being seized in order to cover the government's debts. Most of the nobility and business elite were still happily on board, however, their concerns assuaged by Aisling Connor. Once communications were re-established with the outside world, BSLA Director Ueno ordered the state administrators to begin sending all Star League revenues back towards Earth. The administrators stood opposed to this and refused, but many others at lower levels of government, including the directors of the Narellan and Preston exchanges, followed through with Ueno's request. This resulted in the already badly damaged BSLA fracturing down the middle. The situation worsened when the heavy-handed SLDF response came in April. Hundreds of officials were arrested for simply following the orders of their new Director General. This in turn led many more to side with the Amaris Empire. Thankfully for Kerensky, the vestiges of the loyal Cameron government supported him, and he was able to secure some funding from them. The collection of taxes from the member and territorial states, though, was going to be a more contentious issue. He could safely rule out any support from the periphery, who had left the Star League in all but name. The tenuous ceasefire was not even 10 weeks old at this point. In the end, none of the council lords opposed him, though John Davian was the only one who offered anything more than indifferent approval at this early stage.
Amaris' decision to seize the border worlds and their joint member state Star League administration is perhaps one of his biggest mistakes from the early days of the war. However he wished to couch the proposed handover back to their true home nations, the fact that it was essentially ransom didn't go unnoticed. Realistically, none of the console lords were ever likely to acknowledge him as the new head of the Star League, or the authority of the Amaris Empire over them. And so the takeover of the worlds within their own territory predisposed the lords to treat Amaris as a threat. While much has been said about the lack of aid Kerensky received from the member states, the fact remains that they offered the Empire even less. While the subsequent invasion of the Commonwealth worlds had some strategic importance, the gravest mistake was in trying to capture the commonality capital of Tikhonov. The Capellans already had one regional capital under foreign occupation in the form of Chesterton. They would have never tolerated another, and the attack risked open war. Later events would show that the Empire was never able to fully exploit the worlds within the Terran hegemony. Adding another 20 systems to the Empire required garrisoning in exchange for little in the way of resources, and the guaranteed animosity of his neighbors. This was a poor trade.
The former Rimworld's army had not been idle during this period. Reformed into the Amaris Empire Armed Forces in the immediate aftermath of the coup, under the now commanding general Patrick Scoffins, he had begun by organising the core of his military into the Imperial Liberation Army, with the remainder of his 24 divisions split into the 1st and 2nd Liberation Armies. Those few troops left behind within their home nation would continue to operate as a 4th Rimworld's army. Amaris ordered Scoffins to recruit fresh troops directly from the hegemony. Their goal was to raise 30 new divisions all told. Long term, the Empire could rely on the many military academies within the hegemony now under their control to supply them with loyal and well-trained soldiers, but they needed a short-term stopgap. The hegemony Patriot volunteer units were their answer, the first of which began their training under the Hector O Imperial Division on April 1, 2767. Several existing units, such as the Mexican Legion that had participated in the coup against the SLDF, now freely joined the AEAF, and they expanded to a full brigade. In addition to the new commanding general, Amaris promoted several others within his inner circle to high positions. His uncle Peter Amaris became Minister for Education, Aisling Connor was the new Director of Economic Development, and Samir Anjari took on the role of Amaris Empire Minister for Media. Unofficially, the latter two had a brief relationship, and it was suspected that Samir was the father of Aisling's daughter Efi. Anjari would also become the overall head of the Cryptia, working to expand its influence into the Terran hegemony. On May 19th, Kerensky received a personal message from Amaris himself. In it, the now Emperor gloated his victory over the Camerons, and threatened Alexander with destruction should he rise against him. The fate of Richard Cameron was still kept a secret, as were the events of the Throne Room massacre, but the commanding general understood that there was little to no chance that the First Lord was still alive. Amaris made one critical misstep though. He offered Kerensky a chance to prove his loyalty and confirm his place as a trusted ally. All he need do was subjugate the rebellious territorial states. This betrayal shocked his supposed allies in the periphery and revealed to them Amaris' schemes. Kerensky's response came on the 22nd. He addressed the member and territorial states, announced an end to all ongoing SLDF operations, and declared war on the Amaris Empire. In the days that followed, Kerensky met with Magistrix Janina Centrella and President Alice Avalar, while he dispatched his deputy to treat with Protector Nicoletta Calderon, a person he could no longer stand to face. Amaris' actions had already become known as the Great Betrayal in the periphery, and they were willing to accept an official ceasefire, signed on the 24th of May. The Freedom War had been won. The same day Kerensky had received the message from Amaris, the Epsilon Indi division had deserted en masse. They saw that their namesake planet was under threat and could no longer tolerate inaction. Together with the 568th Armed Transport Flotilla, they turned and headed for home. the commanding general understood that he could delay no longer, and on the 29th issued orders for all SLDF armies within the periphery to redeploy to points Epsilon and Kappa within the Lyran Commonwealth. The Star League Defense Force was going to war. During the early hours of June 1st, 2767, the AWOL Epsilon Indi Division appeared in their home system and started moving towards the planet. Their warship complement consisted of a Black Lion and Potemkin-class cruiser, 2 Aegis cruisers, and 4 Lola destroyers, plus the 20 jump ships that transported the bulk of the division. A day later, they were challenged by the Space Defense System. Unsurprisingly, it refused to accept them as a friendly force, and soon 56 drone warships were arrayed against them. The defending drones scythed through the approaching vessels, swiftly destroying the entire transport flotilla. Only a mere 10% of the division lived to make landfall, and those were soon destroyed by the Imperial forces in garrison. None survived the battle, but reports of the bloodbath reached Kerensky via a civilian vessel not long afterwards. Analysis revealed the challenges that he would likely be facing in going up against the STS, but also some potential weaknesses.
The STS would go on to become one of the greatest hurdles that Kerensky would face during his campaign against Amaris. Some question whether the system was worth having at all. When one looks at the results of the STS during the war, it can be seen to be a highly effective and difficult foe to overcome without suffering great losses. The SLDF would have to develop entirely new tactics to counter and confuse the combat systems of the STS network to grind their way toward Terra. So from this point, yes, the STS was a worthwhile investment. That being said, the entire point of its existence was to protect the hegemony and the Star League as a whole, and here it completely failed.
On June 2nd, word of Kerensky's declaration of war reached the Rimworld's capital of Apollo. The vast majority of the SLDF had been deployed on the far side of the inner sphere from them, and so they had not anticipated a significant threat. If an attack was coming, it was likely months away. At 3 AM the following morning, 12th Fleet launched Operation Black Buck against Apollo. The brainchild of retired Commodore Janos Grek, orbital strikes were made against key infrastructure, including the spaceport and the Amaris Palace, levelling the facilities. Rimworld's regent Mohammed Salim realised the war would be coming to him much sooner than he anticipated. In the aftermath of the coup, the LCAF had redeployed the bulk of their forces to face the presumed hostile Amaris Empire, both the hegemony and the much longer Rimworld's Republic border. Those troops got quite a shock when the first SLDF armies started to materialise in the Ilarian system, followed a few weeks later by another large deployment at Romulus. Kerensky did not trust the Draconis Combine, suspecting they were involved in the coup, and so therefore ordered all his troops to avoid the realm and take the long way around the hegemony. Even still, by late July, the last troops from the Outwards Alliance had arrived.
Kerensky as a general wielded near unlimited power within the ranks of the SLDF by respect alone. He'd fought on the front and wagered his own life to make the hard calls. He was one of them. He was fighting for his home, and despite his own family under Amaris' thumb, he didn't rush to their aid or barter for their safety. He served this state, and when offered everything, he simply said no. His legacy is a reminder of the meaning of actual service above all, and what sacrifice actually means.
The reasons Kerensky chose to target the Rimworlds instead of the Terran hegemony are myriad. For starters, he was leading a broken and wounded army. Reorganizing them into any sort of force capable of retaking Earth was going to take time. Choosing a softer target would gain them valuable experience fighting within their new structure, similar to Lord Onaga's plan prior to his assault on the Hades cluster during the Reunification War. Another reason was that they badly needed a central base from which to operate. The SLDF were persona non grata within the periphery, and weren't particularly welcome within the member states either. The Rimworlds had a well-developed and undamaged industrial base from which they could rearm, in addition to a wealth of resources they sorely needed. Lastly, it would give them time to let fiery tempers subside so they could fight with discipline and focus during their eventual counterattack on the hegemony. Many within the Amaris Empire could see the writing on the wall. The Rimworlds was about to suffer an invasion of overwhelming proportions. The 23rd Amaris Dragoons mistakenly believed that their emperor had meant for them to redeploy within the hegemony, as many had transferred to replace losses after the coup. They left the periphery soon before the fighting started, but upon arrival at summer, they were shocked to find that Amaris had branded them as traitors. A brief engagement with the newly formed 19th Hegemony Patriots Regiment resulted in the Dragoons withdrawing, the survivors heading for the Draconis Combine.
The 23rd Amaris Dragoons was the first unit from within the newly formed AEAF to desert. Though it wouldn't be the last, Amaris' faction would not suffer any serious issues of that nature until the latter stages of the war. The same cannot be said for the Star League Defense Force. Dozens of units had either fled or flipped sides during the Periphery Uprising, and of those who had fought for the rebels, only 2 survived 2767. The 29th CAAN Marine within the Magistracy, and the 159th Hussars inside the Concordat. While the Epsilon Indy Division was the only unit of its size to desert, many smaller groups followed suit in the ensuing months and years, particularly as Kerensky continued to delay his return to the hegemony. Worse, the SLDF was forced to undertake pirate hunting missions against some of their former comrades. The 11th Hussars, now styling themselves as the Battered Brood, had built a nasty reputation based on piracy. Several other battalions attempted to forge a similar path before they were destroyed by the still loyal SLDF. In 2770, the 192nd Dragoons formed the pirate band McLaren's Forgotten, using the chaos of the Civil War to prey on undefended worlds. The following year, the few survivors of the disbanded 238th Mechanized Infantry turned brigand, raiding the vulnerable planets of the Rimworld's Republic as Karen's children.
Amaris had never intended to lose the Rimworld's Republic, and Kerensky's move to invade his home nation had caught him completely by surprise. The Rimworld's army was a scant 12 line regiments and a number of reserve units, adding up to a mere 15 battle mech and 36 conventional regiments in defense. 45 militia units were their only support. They were about to face off against a combined 14 SLDF armies, a terrifying total of 789 battle mech and 882 conventional regiments. To say that the Rimworlds were unprepared to face such an assault would be an understatement. Frantically, Emperor Amaris dispatched word to the Secret Army survivors, ordering them to redeploy, but given that hardly any called the Republic home, and that Amaris had recently thrown them under the bus, very few heeded the call. In fact, a handful of small companies actually joined the SLDF. Most simply dispersed back into their own nations, now notionally free of the Star League, handing over their equipment to their house militaries. On August 9th, the time had come, and the SLDF demanded the Rimworld's surrender. Mohammed Salim refused. The invasion began at once. The attacking force was divided into 2 halves. Task Force Kerensky would focus on the Corwood provinces, whereas Task Force de Chevalier would approach from the opposite end. 3 armies within each task force would take point and leapfrog over each other during their advance. The 4 reserve armies would move into garrison positions behind them. These forward elements were organised into the newly stood up 14th and reconstituted 10th Army Group, formerly Army Group Amaris, while the Periphery Uprising commands were disbanded. The SLDF's initial advance was slow and cautious. The history lessons of the reunification war gave them ample reason to be worried. However, it soon became apparent that resistance was almost non-existent. Those planetary militia garrisons they encountered provided only token opposition before surrendering. The actual Rimworld's army was nowhere to be found. This only added to their paranoia. The enemy was out there though, and the regular army soon fell victim to the insidiousness of the RWA. On persistence, a Rimworld's POW detonated an explosive vest within the camp of the 57th Mechanized Infantry Division, killing 2 dozen. This resulted in yet more caution, further slowing their advance. As the Starleague troops continued, more of the defense force was relocating to the Rimworlds behind them. Of the 5 SLDF armies which had not yet participated in the fighting, 80% of their strength now joined together to form the second wave, organised alongside the reserve from the first wave into the 15th and 17th Army groups. Together, they added another 549 battle mech and 513 conventional regiments to the mix, for a total of 1,338 mech and 1,395 conventional. One of the early goals of Task Force Kerensky was the capture of Apollo's jump points, which they achieved during the second wave in September. They then captured every HPG within 50 light years of the capital, isolating the leadership of the Rimworlds from the rest of their nation, just as Gregory Amaris had been centuries before. The first of the 20 Castles Bryan 20th Army had abandoned back in 2757 was encountered on Cercinus in September during de Chevalier's third wave of assaults. Unsurprisingly, the facility was now occupied by the 23rd Amaris Chasseurs. It took 6 weeks for the Airborne Dragons and Altair Division, a force 18 times their size, to flush them out, securing Camp Amber on October 25th. If the Rimworlds was going to act as a base of operations for the SLDF, they would need to establish naval yards to service their many fleets. One of their earliest targets was the hidden facility within the Dark Nebula. Despite its proximity to the capital Apollo, the dangers of navigating such a dense cloud of stars meant Amaris had never launched an expedition to find it. Camelot Command was back online in September, but was too small to maintain the entire navy. In early 2768, the Texas-class SLS Mountbatten led the assault against the shipyards within the Star's End system, constructed by the SLDF during the Reunification War. Though the RWN did not possess any warships in the periphery anymore, their assault dropships still put up a determined defense. Colonel Stephen McKenna led the Mountbatten's combat air group to victory after 14 hours of grueling combat, securing the facility intact. The last major dry dock was in the Erin system. Upon their arrival, Rimworld's saboteurs moved to deorbit the entire complex to deny the invaders its use. Quick action on the part of SLS Bambara's crew managed to save around 40% of the shipyard by using their own hull to push it back into a stable orbit. These 3 bases went most of the way to meeting their needs, but additional facilities were constructed in the years after, including another secret base at Odessa. The first year of the invasion did not play out in the way Kerensky had anticipated. Organised resistance dissipated in front of them, and in numerous incidents they arrived in time to find that Rimworld's forces had risen up against their political officers and executed them. These individuals professed to be true Republicans, not Amaris fanatics, a large part of the reason why they had not been entrusted with Operation Apotheosis. The RWA was already comically outgunned, but when pressed, it was revealed that more than half of their strength in the Rimworlds was actually an illusion. In the century since the Reunification War, the Amaris family had tried their best to eradicate the shadowy Rif Republican army. Gregory's decree that the RRA were an illegal group had begun the civil war that had raged concurrently to the Inner Sphere spanning conflict, and though they would lose both fights, the RRA continued to exist underground. The arrival of the SLDF was the opportunity they had long hoped for. They quickly established themselves as the dominant force on a planetary level. For the most part, the Starleague forces maintained discipline, and were reserved in their conduct and use of strategic weapons during the invasion. There were a number of exceptions though. Food riots on Machu Picchu resulted in a brutal response which left more than a dozen dead and many more wounded. The worst incident was the execution of 100 prisoners of war at Kutai Junction by the 90th Dragoons. Samir and Jari spun all of these atrocities into propaganda back in the hegemony, which only added to their support. The first year concluded with a near disaster for the SLDF on August 17th. In a repeat of the Fort Simpson incident that had sparked the Periphery Uprising, a nuclear device was smuggled into Fort Merrimack on Erewhon. The arrival of the bomb was timed to coincide with an inspection by none other than the commanding general himself. Miraculously, the driver was shot on approach, and the dead man switch failed to activate, sparing the lives of hundreds at the base, Kerensky included. In late October, the tensions that had been building on Apollo ignited into open rebellion. At first, the 6th Amaris Lancers and 832nd Amaris Dragoons were dispatched to quell the riots, but soon they too fell into fighting among themselves as the Salim Regency lost all legitimacy. Kerensky had not planned an assault for some time yet, but could see that the moment had come, quickly dispatching the 11th Army to establish a beachhead, an act that would earn them the nickname Apostles of Apollo. Upon arrival, they found very little organised resistance left. The last of the planetary militia had holed up inside 2 imitation Castles Bryan built by Amaris, but were overrun 3 days later by Major General James McEvity's North American Division. Kerensky arrived soon after at the head of 20th Army. While they were setting up camp, they were approached by Major Philip Drummond of the 832nd Amaris Dragoons. Disillusioned with his emperor, Drummond turned over all the information he had to the SLDF. Later, once his loyalty was no longer in question, he freely joined Kerensky and fought against the Empire. The 2 Star League armies began to advance on the capital city, Terra Prime. Nobody tried to stop them, and they soon discovered why. On October 29th, an angry mob had broken into the palace during the night and dragged Mohammed Salim out into the streets, where they tried and hanged him, bringing an end to the Battle of Apollo after only a week. The war with the Rimworlds wasn't quite over yet, however. The Castles Bryan continued to be a strong point in the RWA defence. Kerensky wanted to see these recaptured for his own use, but in several instances they were forced to turn to nuclear or orbital weapons. The 17th Amaris Dragoons were wiped out in such fashion within Fort Salisbury on Beauvais. Camp Siena was lost when the defenders on Milvano detonated explosives within the tunnels, killing both themselves and 2 whole infantry regiments, the greatest loss of life for the SLDF during the campaign.
Castles Bryan, the mighty fortresses of the Terran hegemony, were envisioned by Brian Cameron as the ultimate defensive installation. They would serve as command posts and fallback points for the SLDF, and over the decades would expand across the inner sphere into the periphery. However, by the time of the Civil War, they were viewed more as symbols of Star League oppression than bastions of protection. 250 years on, they're now associated with something quite different: treasure. For the most part, the SLDF emptied their enormous stockpiles of arms and material for use in their campaign against Amaris, but several bases still housed vast quantities of spare parts, or so-called lost tech. The discovery of an intact base that has somehow escaped being ransacked in the centuries since the fall is equivalent to unearthing a burial site of one of ancient Egypt's pharaohs. Countless stories and legends exist of down-on-their-luck individuals stumbling across an undiscovered site and leaving with a fortune in Star League vintage equipment.
By 2769, the invasion was winding down. The SLDF had managed to retake 11 of the Castles Bryan intact, and 3 more with only moderate damage. The Amaris loyalists had gone to ground, none continued to fight openly. This left a significant power vacuum where once House Amaris and their allies had ruled. Stepping forward were the various RA cells, but on account of their isolated nature, there was little consensus among them. Indeed, several continued to fight with what they considered to be the Star League aggressor. One such group was led by Amaris' estranged cousin, Mikhail, who was neither a friend to the Empire or Star League. Eventually though, the more moderate groups began to coalesce into a unified body. By early 2770, Commanding General Alexander Kerensky was willing to recognize the Rif Republican Army as the legitimate successor to House Amaris. Some 200 years earlier, Catherine Dormax had ignited the Civil War by defying the First Consul's orders to fire upon civilians, and now her descendant Lucian Dormax, notional head of the RA, had a chance to lead the Rimworlds into a brave new future. When the Star League's 18th Army set up their headquarters on Engadine during the invasion of the Rimworld's Republic, they could not have anticipated the insidiousness of the attacks they would soon be subjected to. The Democrats of Brazil and Tobruk Division were responsible for pacifying the planet, but repeated ambushes and strikes saw them chasing ghosts, seeing threats in every shadow. The use of IEDs escalated things further, causing significant casualties to both civilians and soldiers alike. When reports reached General Gabriela Morano that the terrorists had acquired chemical weapons, she ordered her troops to hunker down, anticipating the worst. They waited, but nothing happened. Stories from the locals started to reach them soon after, tales of a night of death, as they called it. Rumours suggested that the entire terror cell had been found dead, killed by an unknown special ops team. Yet the general knew that there was no SAS forces on world. 2 days later, Morano awoke in the night and found a box sitting beside her bed. Within, she found the head of the terrorist ringleader, but it was what she found sitting atop the box that fascinated her. A small, black, folded piece of origami in the shape of a cat. The calling card of House Kurita's mythical assassins, the Nekogami.
The Nekogami, or spirit cats, are as close to an assassin's guild as exists in the Inner Sphere. Based in the Draconis Combine, and sharing many of the same traditions as the ruling House Kurita, they are considered hostile threats by the realm's internal security force. This has not stopped the Coordinator from hiring their services in truly exceptional circumstances. The Nekogami begin their training as children, and by the time they reach adulthood, all aspects of individuality or personality have been abandoned. They are fanatically dedicated to accomplishing their goal. Once hired, their mission ends in either success or death. They are as accomplished at subterfuge and sabotage as they are at assassination. Woe betide anyone who makes an enemy of the Nekogami.
When the Amaris Empire and Star League Defense Force declared war on each other, both sides turned to the member states for support. None was forthcoming, as all cited the need to protect their own borders at this time of high tension. It was a pragmatic decision on their part, as there was little to gain by supporting the winner, and a lot to lose if they found themselves on the wrong side. This was the response of the great houses, but the common citizens of the Inner Sphere had quite a different outlook. Many of them were shocked at what had happened within the Terran hegemony, and outraged that their governments were not sending aid to Kerensky to assist in his liberation campaign. From their perspective, the Star League had been a great success. They were shielded from the harsh realities of life under the League in the periphery, the instability in the hegemony caused by Richard Cameron, or the political infighting, and sometimes real fighting, among the High Councillors. Though their rulers did nothing, the citizens flocked to Kerensky in droves, almost overwhelming the recruitment centres scattered across the Inner Sphere. One of those who signed on during this period was a teenager by the name of Jerome Winson. He'd first seen service in the Blue Star Division in 2770, but would go on to distinguish himself further later in the decade. Those who couldn't enroll with one of the military academies sought another way to join up. Soon, thousands of volunteers were arriving within the Rimworlds, pledging their support. Occasionally, these weren't merely civilians, but AWOL soldiers and their equipment too. So too did the newly liberated Rimworlds Republic add their support. The commanding general welcomed this influx of personnel with open arms. He established a sizable training base outside Camp Amber on Cercinus. The 16th and 18th Army Groups were set up to coordinate these efforts. In 2770, the Black Warriors Mercenary Unit, itself composed of former SLDF personnel, arrived at Cercinus and took over training operations. The largest source for the new recruits was the Lyran Commonwealth. Such was the dissatisfaction with Archon Robert Steiner's decision not to participate in the war, that riots broke out across the realm. His popularity was the lowest of any Archon since the nation's founding days, before Marsden's coup. Even his nephew Kalen Steiner joined up with the so-called Loyalists. Kerensky's volunteer brigades were made up of individuals from all walks of life and from all across the Inner Sphere. Several among them would rise to prominence during or after the campaign.
Originally a major serving in the 832nd Amaris Dragoons for the Rimworlds Republic, Philip Drummond was stationed on the RWR capital of Apollo when a surprise attack came early in June of 2767. 2 squadrons of SLDF made enough passes which ended up destroying the military area of the spaceport and Amaris' palace. Coupled with a blockade, Regent Mohammed Salim was royally crippled, but soon he'd be singing to the tune of the SLDF one way or another, and that way was Drummond's way. Having already become disillusioned by Amaris' coup, the abandonment of the Republic by Amaris was a step too far, and Philip would personally surrender to General Kerensky. Swearing an oath of loyalty to the great general, a man he held respect for, was made a lieutenant in the SLDF before going on to be an incredible source of information on the Rimworlds Republic. providing the SLDF troop movements, tactics, personnel rosters, equipment rosters, and even backdoors and otherwise impenetrable defenses. Philip Drummond was a source of great pride within the SLDF and to Kerensky personally, who would go on to mention Drummond's efforts in speeches. Twin brothers originally serving in the Rimworld's Republic Armed Forces, Nigel and Herv Polchik actually fought against General Alexander Kerensky during the fighting on Apollo, but like many others, found themselves among the disillusioned and would end up siding and joining with Kerensky and the SLDF. The twin brothers were incredible when put together, and General Kerensky would greatly value their skills when working together on the battlefield. From a young age, Sandra Singh had aspirations to become a mech warrior in the SLDF. Born in the Capellan Confederation the same year Richard Cameron became First Lord, Sandra attended a Liao Mech Warrior Academy and found her chance to serve almost immediately after graduating, with the Terran campaign being planned by General Alexander Kerensky. Hans Jorgensen was another mech warrior who flew the Coop to volunteer with Kerensky, formerly hailing from the Roslahag region and serving within the DCMS. Sang and Jorgensen would see regular action throughout the Hegemony campaign, making it all the way to the final confrontation on Terra. The two would meet during the later stages of the war, fall in love, and marry soon after. The volunteer brigade suffered horrific casualties during the campaign, with fewer than 1 in 10 surviving. That is what Kerensky calls a big oof. Those that did would achieve a near-legendary status among their peers, though they had enough humility to not seek godhood like some people. Huh, the name Blake is crossed out here. Weird.
One unlikely group that came to Alexander's aid were the Ronin mech warriors of the Draconis Combine, with whom the SLDF had spent the last century fighting. Compelled by honour and respect to join Kerensky, they were some of the most skilled on Cercinus. The unofficial head of this cadre was Shin Katsumoto, an accomplished duelist. He revealed that the Ronin had been approached by House Kurita and encouraged to lend their skills to the Star League. In this way, Minoru was able to maintain plausible deniability, just as his predecessor Urizen II had during the First Hidden War. Alexander, though, didn't have much trust for anyone from the Combine, still believing that Kurita was in some way aligned with Amaris. The involvement of the Nekogami assassins in what appeared to be covert aid for the SLDF was most puzzling to him. By 2771, 12 volunteer brigades had been formed, approximately a third of which were staffed with inductees from the Republic. The losses suffered by Kerensky's forces during the Rimworld's campaign were more than offset by these volunteers, though several units were still at severely depleted levels as a result of the Periphery Uprising. Even after the replacements took up new posts, 8 divisions and as many independent regiments were still at less than 50% operational strength. Several corps that had suffered the worst of the Periphery Uprising were permanently taken off the rolls: the 13th, 18th, 28th, 38th, 42nd, 58th, and 70th. Shortly after the occupation of Apollo, Commanding General Kerensky initiated Operation Keyhole, an expedition into the Terran hegemony to gather intelligence for the upcoming campaign. The Secret Fleet had made contact with Kerensky early on, but after the loss of several warships on daring raids and guerrilla resupply missions, they scaled back their operations to surveillance on only the most important worlds. Admiral McTiernan now received more than 100 advanced Bug-Eye-class warships that would allow him to significantly expand his intelligence gathering. The international image that the hegemony was projecting at this time was one of perseverance and solidarity in the face of hard times. The citizens had united behind their strong new emperor, glad to be rid of the fool boy Cameron. Aislinn Connor had enacted many new policies, inspiring the business community to work together in pursuit of creating the strongest economy within the Inner Sphere. Terra was in the midst of a scientific boom, with all sorts of new advancements coming out every day. Youth volunteer groups organised under Samir and Jari helped their communities prosper. Kerensky, of course, was the devil incarnate, preying on the weak at the head of his pack of wolves. That was the propaganda. What Operation Keyhole found was a realm in chaos. The business elite that had supported Amaris were indeed starting to reap the benefits, while his troops had free rein to loot and pillage those that stood apart. The scientific golden age was a farce, created artificially by forcing every project across the hegemony to relocate to Earth, regardless of practicality or disruption. Much of the populace did stand in support, but with Jari in full control of the media, they were kept oblivious to some of the darker aspects of the Empire. To strengthen his control over the populace, Amaris formed the Hegemony Security Force, an organisation akin to a secret police, not so dissimilar to the Cryptia of his own realm. Citizens were encouraged to report on any subversives in exchange for financial rewards, which tore communities and families apart. Furthermore, Lisa Outerbridge expanded the Office of Policy and Doctrine into a paramilitary force, now bedecked with appropriately styled uniforms, and increased their oversight within each government department. Every planet's industry had been retooled to support the war effort, and the workers were faced with increasingly brutal demands on their output. Failure to meet these unrealistic goals could sometimes result in entire populations having their food supply cut off. The HSF was imposing a constant state of fear among the populace, disappearing anyone who stepped out of line. The OPD was rounding up the families of the SLDF soldiers and interning them in camps, and did the same with those working in vital industries as a way of inspiring hard work and loyalty. The worst atrocities Keyhole discovered were often perpetrated by the mercenaries in Amaris' employ. Helen, once a favourite holiday destination of Kerensky, had been ransacked by the Burning Tigers mercenary unit, and its people put to the sword. Their occupation had resulted in over 100,000 deaths. Darabont's Damned had committed similar crimes on Zolokofan. Likewise, the Greenhaven Gestapo had looted and burned half of Italy, the ultimate insult to their host nation coming in 2770 with the murder of Pope Clement XXVII. In his final moments, the Pope had managed to transmit messages to the cardinals within the member states' capitals, suspending his authority for the duration of the crisis, and granting them the necessary powers to continue running the Catholic Church. Cardinal Kinzi de' Medici of New Avalon misunderstood the message he received, and believed that he alone was being entrusted with the position. When confirmation reached him of Clement XXVII's murder 2 years later, he proclaimed himself Pope Thomas X on December 5, 2772. Not all mercenaries were so morally destitute. The two surviving Northwind Highlander regiments lived on in hiding, making their home planet a hotbed of insurgents. The Secret Fleet did what they could to supply the Northwind Covenanters' resistance movement, but the abundance of Imperial forces made the task difficult. Additionally, the most prestigious and largest of all mercenary units, the Elysian Lancers, had freely thrown their 9 regiments behind Kerensky. Unfortunately, the Greenhaven Gestapo took their revenge by destroying their Sicilian headquarters on Earth and imprisoning their families.
Mercenary groups are inherently short-lived affairs. As a general rule, most burst onto the scene, spend a few brief years selling their services to whoever is desperate enough to hire them, and then succumb to either battlefield attrition, lack of funding, unscrupulous employers, or the passing of their commander. Occasionally, however, one will stand the test of time. A rare handful of these outfits operating 3025 can trace their origins back centuries. The Illyrian Lancers are as old as the Star League itself. Founded in 2572 by the Elysian Order, at their peak, they were larger than an SLDF division, a feat no other mercenary has ever matched. The Northwind Highlanders go all the way back to 2362. They were so acclaimed that House Cameron, of shared Scottish ancestry, recruited several of their best for service within the Royal Blackwatch. 3 of their regiments suffered brutal losses to the usurper Amaris during the coup, but would rebuild in later years. Oldest of all are the Gravewalkers, who can truthfully claim to have served not just the great houses, but even the proto-states they grew out of.
Recruitment for the 30 new divisions that Amaris had requested had not met the expected targets. To compensate for this, Lisa Outerbridge was given free rein to forcefully conscript as many as 10,000 Hegemony citizens to fill out the roles of the Hegemony Patriots. By 2771, there were 10 double-strength Patriot divisions, though on average each division contained only 2 brigades of grunt infantry. Half of these formed the bulk of the new Home Guard Corps in Patrick Scoffin's reformed Amaris Empire Armed Forces. The losses suffered during Operation Apotheosis and the subsequent invasion of the Rimworlds led to the disbandment of 6 of the former RWA divisions. In their place, a further 14 had been raised, split between the 3 liberation armies. Each was split into 4 corps, 2 for each of the provinces, plus an Imperial Corps for Amaris himself, and the Home Guard which was parcelled out as needed. In total, the Empire could field 172 battlemech and 197 conventional regiments. More than half of the Castle's Bryan had survived the coup, and these now served as the home base for the forces of the Empire. Mercenaries were traditionally placed within one of the Amaris lances, if only for administrative reasons. Even more of these had flocked to Amaris' side, now totaling some 11 divisions. The greatest loss was that of the Taddeo Amaris Imperial Division, though it was replaced by the Imperial Lancers, a unit packed with some of the most ruthless mercenaries in Amaris' employ. One element of their defense that the Empire seemed to have been neglecting was their navy. With the exception of those captured during the coup, only 20 new warships had been added to the fleet. The final 2 Stefan Amaris-class battleships under construction had fallen into Kerensky's hand during the invasion of the Rimworlds. Still, SLDF estimates that Amaris possessed around 200 warships were found to be somewhat optimistic, the true figure being closer to 300. Additionally, nearly 50 orbital defense stations had been constructed across the hegemony. The bulk of their naval defenses were entrusted to their now fully operational space defense systems. Almost all had been returned to service within the first 2 years of occupation. Continued efforts to disrupt the training of officers at Zabebel Ganubi resulted in the vindictive Colonel Vargo Burkenya executing hundreds of Allsop Robotics engineers. Even though Vargo and his command staff were later shot dead by partisans, the critical mass of knowledge had been reached, allowing the Empire to circumvent Allsop Robotics altogether and begin their own training programs. The lion's share of naval construction efforts went into expanding the SDS. Several new designs were launched by Amaris' goons, but none were as formidable as those of the Star League. The SLDF knew that it would only be a matter of time before they faced off against the space defense systems. In the run-up to their campaign against the hegemony, officers were briefed on the challenges that lay ahead. The ill-fated Epsilon Indy expedition may have failed to liberate their homeworld, but the engagement did reveal a flaw in the design to Kerensky, that being a small target within the engine block that if struck would activate the Casper's self-destruct sequence. Apart from the small picket forces found across the hegemony, 25 planets were protected by the more established and layered space defense systems. Attacking any would undoubtedly result in enormous casualties. Terra itself possessed the most formidable of all, the Reagan SDS. A conventional assault would be tantamount to a suicide mission. Without the element of surprise Amaris called on during the coup, Kerensky would have to find some other way to overcome this final hurdle.
The Star League Navy at its apex operated a staggering 1,500 warships divided between their 20 battle fleets, plus half again that number spread across the inner sphere in isolated garrison. As many as 1,000 more older vessels were mothballed or in states of disrepair. The second largest space navy in history, belonging to the Rimworld's Republic, peaked at a mere 300 warships. While they found enough serviceable vessels among the hulks of the captured reserve fleet to replace their losses suffered during the coup, it's still difficult to see how they could have hoped to hold off the larger SLN. That is, until one remembers the existence of the space defense systems. Caspers, essentially AI-controlled Lola-class destroyers, could be found in small numbers orbiting almost every hegemony world. Add to that the 25 systems equipped with entire fleets of the M5 drones, and suddenly Amaris' navy soars to around 2,000 capital ships. Kerensky's saving grace was that the drones were never easily transferred between systems, and so he could reliably predict through intelligence gathered by the secret fleet where he would encounter the fiercest blockade.
The commanding general was still requesting military aid from the member states at this point, but other than a steady supply of volunteers making their way to the Star League recruitment stations or the Rimworld's Republic, none was forthcoming. In fact, it was around this time that Amaris leveraged aid from the Draconis Combine to help quell civilian unrest. They dispatched forces to several worlds within the hegemony, including Athenry, Imbros, and Styx. This allowed him to redeploy his troops to other borders. Kerensky, of course, was unaware of the promises made between Takiro and Minoru regarding Ambassador Drago, and was now sure that House Kurita was playing the two sides against each other, or so he thought. High Command became aware of two colossal supply depots on Halstead Station and Saddlebari within the Benjamin Military District. Despite the enormous wealth of materials housed at those locations, warlord Ayaki Fujiwara had assigned only a tiny detachment of his Benjamin regulars to protect them. At this time, approximately 25% of the SLDF was hard at work dismantling their facilities across the Star League and moving any valuable parts and supplies to their staging posts in the Republic. Kerensky gave the controversial order to launch raids against the Kuritan supply dumps. The engagements that followed perplexed the commanding general. A handful of shots were fired at the approaching SLDF before the defenders turned and orderly marched away, leaving the raiders free access to the facilities. State propaganda cast the Star League as nothing more than pirates, a far cry from their once noble purpose, and yet the DCMS made no efforts to stop them from removing the supplies from the Combine. In fact, upon their way out of Kurita space, they were approached by the carrier DCS Seoul and her escorts, the DCS Kumamoto and Shizuoka. The Draconis Combine Admiralty had never shared the animosity between the ground forces of the two armies, and now these three warships defected to the Star League Navy. It was clear then that while the coordinator publicly denounced Kerensky, he was in fact prepared to offer him covert aid. Following on from the success of Operation Keyhole, Deputy Commanding General Aaron de Chevalier took command of the follow-up operation, Intruder. One of the losses of the Amaris coup had been the elite Terran RCT, but their 5 sister regimental combat teams were still operational and were now tasked with high-risk raids within the hegemony to disrupt Amaris' war preparations. Each established bases along the borders of their former host nations and made repeated strikes into the Empire. At first, this met with some success. The RCTs were careful to avoid any worlds with an SDS and severely harassed the AEAF all across the realm. They even managed to re-establish contact with a handful of SLDF units still fighting within the hegemony, such as the 39th 86th North American Infantry Battalion and the Cam Marines at Carver 5's Quantico Fortress. Operation Intruder primarily relied on civilian transportation to get around, provided to them by volunteers from Freedom and Liberty stations. Colonel Ezra Bradley's 3rd RCT, which operated out of the Draconis Combine, soon ran into the small Kuritan garrisons that the coordinator had sent to Manis. The fights between the two units were brief, minute-long affairs, with both sides looking to disengage as soon as possible. However, the fleeting engagements were significantly exaggerated by rival propaganda within the other 4 member states, and the Kuritans were portrayed as equally villainous to Stefan Amaris himself. This ultimately led Minoru Kurita to declare the SLDF persona non grata within the Combine.
240 years on from the fall of the Star League, neither the SLDF nor Amaris Empire armed forces exist, but remnants of each military can still be seen in 3025 among the mercenary regiments employed by the Great Houses. The former is more conspicuous, with units such as the Eridani Light Horse still proudly waving the banner and maintaining the traditions of a bygone era. However, many citizens would be surprised to learn the number of mercs that can trace their origin back to the Amaris camp. The 21st Rimworld's regiment, the Blue Star Irregulars, is the most obvious, but others such as the always faithful Fuchida's Fusiliers, Grim Determination, Narhal's Raiders, and Raymond's Redcoats all harbor the descendants of those that brought down the fabled Star League.
Now operating from the Free Worlds League, Colonel Bradley dispatched the 19th Striker Regiment to the world of Talitha to conduct a raid. Unfortunately, a double agent for both Amaris and the ISF had managed to infiltrate the unit and alerted the Empire to their presence. Imperial forces ambushed the Strikers on Weld and destroyed them entirely. But despite the losses suffered during the operation, of which the Strikers were just one, it was proving effective. De Chevalier gradually expanded Intruder in scope until 15 mixed brigades were involved, including some of the ad hoc periphery RCTs from the days before the uprising. As 2771 drew to a close, Alexander Kerensky once again turned his attention back towards the Terran hegemony. It had been 5 years since Stefan Amaris launched his coup, and the ultimate showdown between the two sides was looming. He made one last impassioned plea to the Great Houses for support. The best he received was 1 battalion of the 14th Zurich Lancers from the CCAF, who would help liberate the lost Capellan worlds. Kurita, unsurprisingly, said no, but so too did Kenya Marek. He and Alexander had never been on good terms, but until this point the Free Worlds had at least tolerated the SLDF. No longer. The other two realms, while still refusing to offer military aid, helped establish staging posts on several worlds along the hegemony border, as did the Capellan Confederation. And so it was that High Command began to draw up their plans for liberation, Operation Chieftain. The SLDF organised itself into 3 task forces, named for the member states who would provide their logistical backing. Alexander Kerensky led Task Force Confederation, Aaron de Chevalier commanded TF Sun, and Joan Brandt helmed TF Commonwealth. Admiral Ignacio Blake's failing health forced him to step down as Director of Naval Command. His replacement, known as the Professor, the recently re-enlisted and now Admiral Janos Grek, would instead control the Star League Navy during the campaign. Several army groups were restructured at this time. Marik, Kurita and Davian became the 2nd, 4th and 5th respectively. The 15th and 17th, which had handled the occupation forces within the Rimworlds, now became frontline commands, and the 19th through 24th were newly established for Chieftain, with the 23rd taking over training operations away from the front. In January 2772, they began to move. The Dormax government that had taken over the Rimworld's Republic requested that Kerensky leave behind a garrison force to prevent those Amaris troops in hiding from rising back up in their absence. The commanding general was not prepared to do so, as he believed that he would need every man and woman in the battles to come. On February 9th, the last of the SLDF crossed over the border. The Republic was now on its own. It didn't take long for the fires of insurrection to break out, first on Götterdammerung in March, and then on Bucklands and Steelton soon after. All that was behind the SLDF, however, as they closed on their new mustering stations and prepared themselves for what lay ahead. In total, around 2,900 regiments were approaching the Empire, supported by 2,000 warships. On July 14th, 2772, Operation Chieftain commenced.
$100 million dead. That was the number the Star League settled on to qualify their victory in the Reunification War. Of course, that number was disputed by every one of the newly conquered territorial states, with some estimates suggesting that many had been killed on New Vandenberg alone. Nevertheless, while hundreds of millions more were left starving, wounded, and homeless, likely leading to even more deaths than the original war itself caused, and more social trauma that would last generations, the Terran hegemony celebrated their success in bringing civilization to the barbaric frontier. Few could accept, or cared to consider, that the majority of those suffering out in the periphery were people just like them. Just human beings who'd been trying to live their own lives in their own way. None believed such brutality would ever again touch the Golden Worlds at the heart of the new Star League. 2 centuries on, the core of the Star League, and the homeworld of mankind, would find this blood debt would come due. And it would be paid.
Every one of the 100+ worlds that the SLDF liberated over the next few years has a story to tell. The particulars of each could easily be a chapter in our history of the Star League Civil War all by themselves. For the sake of brevity though, we'll discuss the similarities of the campaign in general and look at only the key events, decisive battles, and exceptions to the rule in detail. In total, 66 worlds were targeted during the first wave of Operation Chieftain, approximately 1 for every corps in the SLDF, though each could call for just a single division or sometimes a full army as needed. This initial list of targets accounted for every planet along the border with the rest of the inner sphere. The idea of encirclement on an interstellar stage is unusual. In theory, blockading a region of space is functionally impossible, but the psychological effect of being surrounded on a map had a very real impact on those within. Furthermore, it would prevent Amaris from repositioning troops to hold off a single thrust, as he wouldn't know where the next attack was coming from.
All too often, it's mistakenly said that it was Amaris and his Rimworlders alone who fought the advancing SLDF. In reality, a great many Terran hegemony natives took up arms against Kerensky. While these Patriot divisions were not as well trained or equipped as the other regulars, they still resisted as best as they were able. The fortress battalions assigned to Castles Bryan could prove particularly troublesome. Furthermore, the coup had granted Amaris control of many of the Star League military academies, such as the War Triad within the Sol system, the Combat College of New Earth, Fleet School of Keed, and the Flight Academy of Graham. New tutors were brought in to replace those of uncertain allegiance, in turn producing legions of well-trained and loyal soldiers. The first of the new wave of inductees were graduating just as Operation Chieftain commenced. Over the course of the war, several whole divisions were formed from these graduates, very few of whom hailed from the Rimworld Republic. In every sense of the word, then, the conflict between Amaris and Kerensky truly was a civil war.
Their primary opposition during the opening phase of the campaign came not from the loyal Amaris troops, but from the newly formed Patriot divisions, bolstered by mercenaries, with oversight from the HSF and OPD. Unbeknownst to the Star League, Emperor Stefan Amaris had only resolved to maintain order over a handful of these outer hegemony worlds. The rest would play a part in Operation Tripwire. The idea was for the civilian populace to be used as a means of slowing Kerensky down by manufacturing several humanitarian crises. Agents, saboteurs, and insurgents were widespread, particularly on pro-Amaris worlds, each doing their part to prevent the SLDF from moving on after the main defense had been overcome. While Alexander Kerensky was unaware of the scale of the issue that lay ahead, he had anticipated some of the challenges that would arise during Operation Chieftain in regards to the recently liberated population. To that end, he had formed several new groups that would aid in the transition of power. Civil assistance teams would help form new governments from the shattered remnants of the old. Absolutely no pro-Amaris sentiment was tolerated, regardless of local leanings. Provisional justice courts had the responsibility of seeing that those who had exploited the takeover, and those installed by Amaris, faced the consequences of their actions. It's a testament to their professionalism that these hearings didn't immediately descend into kangaroo courts. Resource reclamation units scoured through the ruins for anything that could be of use to the SLDF, particularly looking out for any industries that could be retooled or brought back online to assist in the war effort. Lastly, Jerome Blake led a team of technicians to restore the HPGs they found back into working order.
Maintaining a logistics chain for such an enormous military was a truly massive task. The captured industry within the Rimworld's Republic had gone some way to replenishing the Star League's depleted munition stores after the uprising, but was too far away to serve as a home base for Operation Chieftain. Two of the member states, the Draconis Combine and the Free Worlds League, had refused to allow them to operate within their borders, and the deployment of the SLDF in a ring around the entire Terran group only added to the complications. Most of the support and logistical commands had lost their senior command staff during the coup, leaving the less experienced staff officers to pick up the pieces. The resource reclamation units did what they could to bring back the hegemony's often devastated manufacturing facilities back online after their liberation, but juggling the limited supplies at their disposal was a constant challenge throughout the campaign. The soldiers on the front line are the ones whose deeds are most often celebrated, but the logistics department produced its own heroes, such as Nigel Carriage and Mitchell Loris, without whom Operation Chieftain would surely have ground to a halt.
Of the 60-odd worlds targeted during the first wave of Chieftain, half of them were taken within a month of the SLDF making landfall. Some took a little longer, but by and large, victory had been achieved by year's end. It would take many more months to root out the Empire's agents, of course, particularly on those with an anti-Cameron government, but for the most part, the regular army faced no real difficulties. Many of these planets were left with just Patriot fortress battalions to defend themselves, the conscripts among which were forced to fight by the ever-present HSF. The occasional mercenary band proved more of a thorn in Kerensky's side, but of the Amaris regulars there was little sign. Kerensky's generals always understood that the greater challenge was going to come from those worlds that possessed Castles Bryan, all of which were now garrisoned by loyal soldiers of the Empire. Several had been destroyed during the coup 6 years earlier, but more than half of them had been occupied through the Humanities Homeworld Defense Act before even that. Where they were lucky, the regular army was able to capture the world after only a few months, but often it took far longer. Slocum was the worst example. The invasion began during the opening days of Operation Chieftain, yet due to a megastorm that had raged unabated for some 5 years, it delayed the final liberation of the planet for a full 27 months. Ultimately, the storm continued for a further 2 decades. During these opening moves, the fighting quickly turned uglier than anything the Star League Defense Force had seen since the Periphery Uprising. Amaris regulars used biological and chemical weapons on several worlds, and both sides made use of nuclear weapons to achieve their objectives. Civilians were often caught in the fallout. The more nefarious Imperial forces were not above using the locals as human shields, either for an edge in combat or as a means to secure an escape off-world, sometimes even strapping hostages to their mechs and vehicles. All too often, Star League soldiers were forced to press ahead in spite of the cost. The SLDF had to come to terms with the fact that they would need to sacrifice some innocent lives in order to free the Star League, a conviction that grew as they pressed deeper into the hegemony and unearthed more atrocities. Unsurprisingly, the civilians were less understanding of this cruel logic, and soon there were millions calling for Kerensky's head. The Empire's navy had been largely caught napping during the initial invasion. They had been busy trying to track down the secret fleet, and were not in a position to resist Admiral Grek's armada. Most were seen off or dispatched without incident, and only on Tigris did they escape notice long enough to open fire on the ground forces before their destruction. There were some pitched naval battles of note, such as the skirmish over Borden. Rear Admiral Dal Heng's flotilla saw off a larger force of 13 warships, thanks to judicious use of boarding actions. Of the 7 SLN vessels that began the battle, only 1 survived, though this was offset by the capture of 2 of the Empires. New Canton was the site of a much larger engagement between half a hundred Star League ships and 24 belonging to Amaris, with a predictable outcome. The existence of the secret fleet headquarters at Lytton 6828 became all the more important as it gave the Navy somewhere within the hegemony to rearm and repair damage without withdrawing to the Rimworlds. Nanking was one of the few outer hegemony worlds that Amaris had decided to make a concentrated effort to hold. Its massive industrial base and population of over 4 billion made it highly prized for his war effort, and a crucial asset to deny Kerensky. 30 Empire warships waited for the Professor to make his move. He obliged them by dispatching Admiral Taro Magre's 5th Fleet, which counted 53 warships on its rolls. Only a dozen of the Amaris vessels escaped, clearing the way for 21st Corps. They faced an uphill struggle against an anti-Star League populace. Things were made more difficult for them with the arrival of reinforcements culled from other worlds within the Empire, plus the remnants of the Nanking and New Canton fleets. Initially, they slipped past Magre, but the Admiral led a dozen warships on a desperate jump to a nearby pirate point around the planet. Only 9 of them materialized at the other end, but it bought enough time for the rest of the fleet to catch up and stop the counterattack. Nanking would be the greatest challenge Task Force Confederation faced during the first wave, and in the end, it took over a year for Amaris to cede control. Of all the worlds targeted during the first phase of Operation Chieftain, none were more important than the provincial capital of Lone Star. The planet served as a sink-or-swim moment for the entire invasion, the first time since the flight of the Epsilon Indy Division that the Star League had faced off against a space defense system. Admiral Brandt assigned the combined might of 8th and 13th Fleets to be commanded by Admiral Vicho Namani, with the difficult task of liberating the system and clearing the way for 44th Corps. The assault was one of the first moves of Chieftain, beginning July 2772. Neither of the decoy squadrons dispatched to the system's jump points were successful in luring the Caspers away, so instead, both recombined at the zenith alongside the rest of the fleet to launch their attack. 70 SLM warships faced off against 62 M5 drones, more than 100 M3s, and a pair of defense stations. The battle started with an opportunistic strike at Namani's flagship, a sign of the drone's frightening intelligence, but after they were seen off, it began in earnest. The Caspars targeted first the more heavily armed but weaker armoured cruisers and destroyers, while the smaller drones inflicted punishing losses against the League's aerospace fighters. The crews of the powerful Luxor-class vessels unfortunately became priority targets for the drones. The abundance of massive battleships assigned to the invasion gave the Admiral an edge, finally destroying the last of the drones after a punishing 1-hour fight, but not before losing a third of his fleet. The defense stations were captured soon after, then 44th Corps and their small escort was called in. The entire invasion force now burned hard for Lone Star. His fleet now numbered 60 warships and 200 dropships. The Admiral was intercepted en route by 2/3 of the Nadir drones. This time, they targeted the troop transports first. The regular army suffered horrific casualties of around 25% before the last Caspar was destroyed. Rather than lose any more, Nemani made the sound decision to land 44th Corps on the moon of Vespa before he cleared out the space around Lone Star proper. The final hurdle was one more wave of 40 Caspars, stationed defensively around 3 orbital defense stations. Again, they were not fooled into leaving their positions, forcing the Star League Navy to come into range of the stations in order to destroy them. Sadly, while ultimately successful, the Admiral would not survive the attack. His flagship, SLS Keribus, was lost with all hands in the opening minutes. The battle for the surface, begun on July 25th, was no more forgiving than that in space. More nukes were employed by the Empire during the 19-month campaign than anywhere else during the first wave, with almost every city suffering at least one strike. The death toll was so high and the damage to the planet so catastrophic that eventually the surviving population emigrated off-world. Lone Star, once a jewel in the hegemony's crown, is now all but forgotten to history. The second STS the Star League faced at Nusakan happened more or less concurrently with Lone Star. Only the Battle of Robsart during the Reunification War was larger, though the casualties that had sent Admiral Franklin on a killing frenzy 2 centuries earlier were nothing compared to what the SLDF was now suffering. More than 100 SLM warships arrived at the Nadir to overpower around 70 mixed drone sizes. Rather than advance on the planet, Admiral Marina Akayev Cameron lingered long enough for half of the 27 Empire warships in system to materialize around them and straight into the waiting guns of her fleet. After thwarting the attempted rear attack, the Admiral next directed her fleet to clear out the secondary worlds in the system, which in turn prompted the second drone fleet and surviving Amaris vessels to try and hunt her down. This opened the door for 27th and 51st Corps and their escorts to arrive at the zenith and clear out the few defenders left there. After luring the Empire ships into dead space, Akayev Cameron then jumped from one pirate point to another around Nusakan itself, destroying the STS emplacements before the drones could reach them. Her smart tactics up until this point only made possible a victory by a narrow margin. After the final battle, 80% of the SLM warships had been destroyed. The ground invasion was similarly brutal, though thankfully the majority of the civilian populations escaped the use of WMDs.
As the Star League Defense Force advanced towards Terra, they were suffering high attrition rates. Their techs were busy struggling to maintain the aging and battered mechs after a decade of near-constant fighting. Often they were left scrambling to find replacements in an effort to keep units at operational strength. Leading up to the Amaris coup, the member states had been rapidly expanding their house militaries, but this expansion slowed to a crawl during the war, as they took the opportunity to fleece Kerensky for as much money as they could. Previously, the SLDF had shied away from using armored vehicles, as the Terran hegemony could supply them with a near unlimited number of battle mechs. Now, they were forced to buy in bulk second-rate tanks and light armor from anyone who would do business with them. These would form the basis of the ever-increasing number of tank regiments within the SLDF, which would suffer from some of the worst casualty rates within the regular army during the campaign. While mech warriors still took the lion's share of the glory, tank commanders like Simas and Lena Osis of the 238th Armored Division would also make a name for themselves during the Civil War.
In the latter part of 2772, those corps that had an easier time of things so far moved towards their follow-on targets. The first of these was the assault on Summer that September, the final SDS Task Force Commonwealth was facing. Learning from Lone Star and Nusakan, Admiral Godman Lawrence devised a number of novel strategies. The first was to use captured IFFs on their ships in the hope that it would confuse the drones or lead them to attack the Amaris vessels, as had happened at Nusakan when the latter had accidentally opened fire on a Casper and then been subsequently destroyed. Sadly, this proved little effective. His other plan was to make judicious use of boarding teams to get aboard the drones and trigger their self-destruct from the inside. This was much more successful than first anticipated. After middling success at the first jump point, Lawrence overwhelmed the drones at the second with enormous numbers of small craft. A third drone fleet encountered en route to the planet was likewise disabled. The bulk of the killing and the casualties sustained was still down to the warships though, and this was a resource that the Starleague Navy had little hope of replenishing. The planet itself was not as costly, with the local population rising up in support of Kerensky and helping to overthrow the Amaris government. The last of the worlds that had been on the initial list of targets for Wave 1 and the first SDS Task Force Sun was facing was Al-Nair. The planet itself was not much to speak of, but it was the many resource-rich asteroids that made the system so valuable. Taking a page out of Lord Damien Onaga's playbook, 14th Army spent additional time training in zero-G operations at Murchison. Meanwhile, Admiral Ilse Juan Sanchez shrewdly waited to analyse the after-action reports from Lone Star, Nusakan and Summer. The operation would begin in November. When she arrived, she did so in force, at the head of 80 warships and 317 dropships, each carrying Marines for boarding actions. The zenith was quickly secured and the Admiral began the long journey towards Al-Nair proper. The various Caspers scattered across the system converged to meet her there. 148 of them faced off against the SLM fleet. 71 were destroyed before they retreated, but it cost the Starleague 38 warships and more than 5 dozen dropships. They attacked again 3 days later, bringing the casualties on both sides to around 100 drones and dropships and 50 warships. Juan Sanchez spent the next 5 months hunting down the survivors, while 14th Army began the year-long process of clearing out the hundreds of mining outposts. The rest of the secondary targets played out as before. Some fell quickly, whereas others, particularly those with Castles Bryan, would prove more challenging. The varying success of the first wave so far meant that many units didn't reach their follow-on objective until early 2773. The 6th and 16th fleets had originally been assigned to break through the SDS outreach and clear the path for 55th Corps, but concerns over ineffectual SLN tactics in the prior engagements meant they were instead dispatched to Heshnar. For their troubles, they faced repeated WMD strikes and counterattacks from Imperial reinforcements, but it became an important staging ground for future operations.
When Amaris seized power at the end of 2766, the Rimworld's army moved swiftly to eliminate not just the SLDF regulars, but also many reservists stationed on Terra. As Operation Apotheosis began, Amaris' agents quickly worked through a list of names, eliminating the various generals and colonels before they understood what was happening. To dispatch those less senior officers, they relied heavily on local criminal elements to provide the necessary manpower. Among the individuals targeted for assassination was Major Antonius Zalman, commander of a reserve battalion based at Sao Paulo. When the nearby Castle Bryan at Curitiba was hit with a nuclear strike in the opening minutes of the attack, Zalman and his unit were alerted to the threat just in time to prevent their murder at the hands of a gang of hired thugs. The survivors would go on to form a resistance cell operating out of the Amazon rainforest. In 2773, Antonius' group learned that political dissidents were being shipped off-world to be used as human shield so that units ordered to withdraw towards the Hegemony Corps had a chance to escape. Zalman's guerrilla unit smuggled themselves aboard the dropships leaving Mexico City and arrived at the front line. There, they were able to free the prisoners and wipe out the Republican Guard HQ. Hijacking a trio of mechs, they went on to destroy numerous supply dumps around the world. By the time the SLDF arrived to secure the planet, the defenders had barely enough munitions to last a week, sparing the lives of many civilians. Zalman was decorated for his outstanding service and given command of Kerensky's personal bodyguard.
Throughout 2773, those lucky few units that had not become bogged down moved on to their tertiary objectives, while others were only just launching the first of their follow-ups. These were almost invariably long drawn-out campaigns, the SLDF having lost most of its momentum. In the case of Aflir and Erai, Amaris warships were able to cause devastating losses through the use of orbital bombardments. One world that might have been much worse was New Dallas. Thankfully, New Dallas's SDS had been wiped out during the coup, and only a handful of drones had been replaced. The use of captured Empire warships allowed the SLDF to sneak aboard the orbital defense stations before the fighting began in earnest. Even still, the 3 Castles Bryan on world made it a tough conquest. As the Rimworld's Republic entered 2773, the turmoil that came about after the collapse of the Imperial government and the rise of President Lucian Dormax was starting to settle down. The realm had internally divided itself into the small fiefdoms of prominent RRA leaders and former Amaris supporters. The loyal RWA troops that had resurfaced after the departure of the SLDF had once again been pushed back underground. Now that they were no longer actively fighting among themselves, Dormax saw that the time was right to meet with the other groups to discuss how the Republic should govern itself going forwards. To that end, he arranged for a conference on Apollo to be held on the 5th of May. That April, scattered reports started to filter through that worlds along the border were under attack, though from whom remained a mystery until word reached them from Kikuyu. The Lyran Commonwealth had finally stirred itself and had taken aim at the former Amaris holdings. Robert Steiner's decision not to provide Kerensky with aid had proven a major embarrassment for the Archon. His approval ratings had plummeted, and legions of his own citizens, among them deserting LCAF troops, were flocking to the SLDF to volunteer their services. He needed some way to reverse those trends, and so throughout the tail end of 2772, had the Lyran High Command planning Operation Ulmerich, the invasion of the Rimworlds. The fact that the Republic no longer supported Amaris and had a new pro-Starleague government installed made no difference to the Commonwealth. They saw both the threat of another future Stefan on the border and also the potential for aggressive expansion at the expense of a now woefully undefended neighbour. Their justification for the invasion was that many RWA troops were still in hiding, poised to launch future attacks if given the opportunity. That this wasn't an outright fabrication does little to excuse their actions. Operation Ulmerich immediately drew the attention of Alexander Kerensky. The message he sent the Archon gave Robert reason to pause. It was made abundantly clear that the commanding general would not tolerate the invasion and make full use of the SLDF to stop Steiner if necessary. With Operation Chieftain approaching the end of its first year though, it was clear to the Lyrans that Kerensky was in no position to reassign his troops to aid the Republic, and so Ulmerich pressed ahead. In August 2773, Task Force Commonwealth landed on the 3 worlds of Athenry, Imbros and Styx. There they made a shocking discovery. All 3 had been garrisoned by DCMS forces at Amaris' request. Thinking he had an ally in Kurita, Stefan had denuded many of the systems in that region of defences, not anticipating Kerensky's encirclement strategy, which in turn left the Draconis border vulnerable. Upon arrival, the SLDF found the Imperial government had been overthrown and the planets claimed as a combined protectorate. The Kuritans welcomed the Starleague, whereas before they had shunned it, but this was all part of the Coordinator's plan. By offering their assistance in the safe occupation of those worlds, they freed up what SLDF troops might have been assigned to the occupation. In the long run, of course, they had their sights firmly set on repatriation of the systems into the Draconis Combine proper. It was on Styx that a young Konrad Toyama joined the roving band of technicians led by Jerome Blake, when he used his underground contacts to source parts vital in restoring the planet's damaged HPG. In the coming year, Kurita sent aid shipments and troops to disperse them to several other hegemony worlds, all with the goal of building relationships with the local governments and potentially absorbing them too. Despite the obvious double dealing, Kerensky was glad of the subversive aid as it allowed him to more quickly respond to counterattacks launched far behind the front lines, such as the capture of Milton's capital city in late 2774. The last world to see combat in Wave 1 of Operation Chieftain was Connaught. Beginning in August 2773, the Starlink used the same strategy as at New Dallas to sneak aboard and capture 3 of the 4 orbital defense stations. The 30 Amaris warships and system couldn't prevent the appearance of SLDF troops at a pirate point, and despite reinforcements arriving from elsewhere in the Empire, ultimately Connaught was captured in November 2774, by which point Chieftain had thoroughly ground to a halt. The Liberation campaign required new staging posts deeper into the hegemony, and constructing them became top priority. Kerensky had also run out of patience with Kenyan Marek delaying his efforts to move Starlink supplies out of the free worlds. He dispatched troops to the worlds that the Council Lord had blocked access to. Irian, Kalidasa, and Orient were all raided, the latter almost leading to a major incident. Thankfully, the Starlink forces left the system just before the arrival of the FWLM. Nevertheless, it was a bold action that won the commanding general little favour from that region of space. To plan the next phase of their campaign, High Command met for the first time in over 2 years on the recently liberated world of Talitha. To keep the Talitha conference secret, each senior general and admiral arrived aboard routine aid and supply shipments, so as to not draw undue attention. So far, Operation Chieftain had cost them 30 divisions. Each world taken was inflicting around 10% casualties, though the numbers were heavily skewed by the 4 SDSs they had faced. These were not sustainable losses. As they continued towards Terra, they would have to face ever more of these defences. To overcome this, they established Project Nike with a mandate to find some form of SDS countermeasure. Until this was accomplished, there would be no further assaults. The exception to this was the breakthrough at Carver 5. The Eridani Light Horse successfully reinforced the Camarines fighting since Christmas 2766, cutting off the head of the Imperial forces when they killed General Milton Davis. Though Amaris was not yet ready to give up the world, it gave hope that a final victory on Carver was almost at hand. In early January 2775, the Amaris Inner Circle was evaluating their position. With limited numbers of troops at their disposal, they had forsaken the Outer Worlds to concentrate their resources on those closer to Terra. Operation Tripwire had slowed Kerensky's advance, but not as much as they had hoped. Their fleet had also taken a beating, now numbering at just over 150 warships. General Knorr, the Empire's Director of Strategic Operations, drafted a list of 12 worlds of little importance that might be sacrificed to further delay the SLDF's advance. The garrison commanders were instructed to use their full arsenal of WMDs against the civilian population and then withdraw to more valuable worlds. That such an atrocity was even tabled, let alone approved, speaks to the change in mental state of the Empire's elite. Following this successful coup, Amaris and his closest allies had been seen holidaying on the garden worlds of the hegemony, even after the loss of the Rimworld's Republic. While the Empire might not have been a utopian society, for the average citizen it was no worse than the disruptive years that had preceded it. There was genuine hope that things would soon get better. Kerensky's inexorable advance had changed all that. Late October 2773, Stefan Amaris had been seen stalking through the halls of the royal palace, laser pistol in hand, firing at anyone and anything that reminded him of Cameron. As he went, he could be heard muttering under his breath, pleading with and berating the ghost of Richard. A madness was beginning to take hold of the Emperor. The brutal plan went ahead on January 19th, though some units, such as the 38th Amaris Fusiliers stationed on Castor, took the opportunity to break out, abandoning their Emperor and headed for the secret army remnants in the periphery. When the SLDF learned of the redeployment, they seized the opportunity to liberate a further 12 systems without bloodshed, but were horrified to discover the carnage that awaited them on planet. Ultimately, General Knorr's plan was a success, but it was not one he would be able to celebrate. Stefan Amaris had sunk into a deep depression, his behaviour growing ever more erratic, and despite never having vocalised his feelings on the matter, one planet was on the wrong side of a boundary he did not wish to see crossed. The SLDF had been held at arm's length, but after taking up positions on Asta, they were now only a single jump from Terra. General Mulan, not thinking to question his orders, destroyed the extensive fortifications on Weld before departure. He, his staff, and his family paid the price, as did General Knorr, who was dispatched to Carver to lead the last of the failed counterattacks. In his place, Antilos Legos became the new Strategic Operations Director, much to the chagrin of Patrick Scoffins.
Discovering the scale of the atrocities was weighing heavily on the SLDF as they advanced deeper into the hegemony, and High Command was no exception. During Amaris' crackdown on religious groups within the Empire, the Abbey of the Resurrection on Procyon was ransacked and its leaders put to death. Smuggled off-world was the grandson of the former Pope of the Church of the Crucifix, Wyndham Khatib. He signed up with the SLDF after completing his studies and was assigned to the Joan of Arc Division, but after its destruction was personally assigned by Deputy Commanding General Aaron de Chevalier as chaplain captain for the SLDF High Command. His sermons and counsel would help the senior generals and admirals maintain a degree of calm and level-headedness, without which many more lives would have been lost.
Among the ruined worlds, Project Nike stumbled across a real bounty. Hidden within a janitor's closet at Nirasaki Computers Collective was a personal device belonging to Dr. Catherine Glimp, containing her team's complete research into SDS vulnerabilities, created shortly after the coup. Her final act gave the SLDF an opportunity where before they had none, and within weeks they had a prototype SDS jammer up and running. The technological monstrosity they created weighed an incredible 30,000 tons, and any warship fitted with the device would be severely hampered in a fight. Nevertheless, the Star League needed to press ahead and decided that the world of New Home, deep within the hegemony core, would be the site of the decisive battle. More aid was arriving from the member states meanwhile, primarily targeting border worlds and those with a previously shared ownership status. Copying the successful Curitan strategy, John Davian dispatched police and infantry to help maintain order, and soon the rest of the Council Lords followed suit. No assistance arrived from the associate members, as each was now dealing with a crisis of their own making. By clandestinely funding terrorist groups within their borders for decades as a way to subvert Star League authority, they were now left with several heavily armed groups who were in no way inclined to hand over their weapons or bow down to their notional rulers. In March, the Marik Captain General dispatched all pretense and brazenly seized Shirtan, Judonay, and Wing. The regular army forces on planet were instructed not to resist. Emboldened by his success, he tried to do the same with Connaught that May, only this time Kerensky put his foot down. The 2nd Marik Militia suffered 24 casualties before the unit surrendered and was moved to a POW camp on Talitha. 4 more Marik regiments were evicted from the hegemony in like fashion soon after. The time had come to launch the second wave of Operation Chieftain. Throughout February, the 24th Army Group massed on Brownsville, while 4th Fleet grew in size to over 100 warships. Admiral Akayev Cameron's success at Nusakan won her the job of leading the assault on New Home. 25 vessels had been jury-rigged with the SDS jammers, and they were about to get their first field test. On March 29th, she jumped her armada to a pirate point above the planet, and the battle began. 53 Casper drones moved to engage them, but almost immediately it became apparent that they were not coordinating their efforts as before. They still posed an enormous risk to any individual ship, but their overall effectiveness was reduced significantly. Furthermore, the SDS emplacements on worlds had severe difficulty targeting the naval units overhead. In just 45 minutes, all the drones had been eliminated, and only 4 warships had been lost. The Project Night ships fared the worst of all. 2 were destroyed outright, and another permanently disabled by their own countermeasures. Several others suffered debilitating systems failures. Nevertheless, they had proven successful, and Akayev Cameron then jumped her LF battery-equipped fleet to the Nadir. Word had only just reached them that New Home was under attack, and they were not prepared for the SLN's sudden appearance. However, the SDS operators now knew to target the jammer warships as a priority. The Admiral, though, employed the night ships in pairs for this second battle, with only half activating at the outset, and the reserve ships only coming online if the lead vessels stopped functioning. Only one was disabled during the second clash. While this was going on, an advance force spearheaded by the 1st and 5th RCTs had made landfall and was busy eliminating the ground SDS batteries ahead of 7th Army's arrival. Despite large concentrations of Imperial troops on New Home, they were slow to respond to the threat and were completely overwhelmed once the rest of the SLDF touched down on April 8th. The fleet, meanwhile, was eliminating the final drone swarm at the zenith. Project Nike had proven to be a massive boon to the Star League, with casualties far lower than prior battles. The only major loss was the SLS Vengeance, formerly RWS Gregory Amaris, one of 2 Stefan Amaris-class battleships captured during the RimWorlds campaign. New Home, then, was a resounding success. It demonstrated to the Empire that nowhere was safe, and Kerensky ordered all task forces to resume their advance. As the second wave got underway in earnest, it quickly became apparent that while the use of WMDs had been a rare tragedy in the first 2 years of Chieftain, it was becoming increasingly common as they drew closer to Terra. General Legos had pushed for their expanded use as Strategic Operations Director, and nobody was spared from the consequences. The worst atrocity was the firebombing and deliberate overload of a nuclear plant at Neo-Tokyo on Yori. Millions were killed, the greatest loss of life for a single city during the entire campaign. As the SLDF advanced, they found that each planet's civilian population behaved in one of 2 ways. They either had active resistance cells, such as the Northwind Covenanters, who had been fighting the Amaris government since long before their arrival, or were completely broken, reacting to the Star League presence with fear and mistrust. Several citizens were forced to become extremists by the OPD, who were holding their families hostage. They threatened to harm them if they didn't turn on the SLDF, in the worst cases detonating suicide vests among their ranks. On Altair, after vanquishing the majority of the defenders and driving the survivors off planet, reports started filtering through of sporadic mech battles happening on the outskirts. This transpired to be none other than the 3rd Arcab Legion, who had supposedly come to help the locals after hearing Amaris had abandoned them. No one was fooled by this, but the arrival of a dozen DCMS aid dropships allowed the Kuritans to maintain a presence there, even after the Arcab Legion was forced to return home. Likewise, in August, the 2nd Marek Militia was sent home from their brief internment on Talitha. Dayron was the toughest target the SLDF faced at the outset of Wave 2. Beginning on May 27th, the battle would go on to rage for 2 years, accounting for a final death toll in the millions. Project Nike had refined its jammer technology, and more than 30 of their vessels were dispatched to the system, of which 14 were the surviving prototypes from New Home. The more advanced models caused less interference with the parent ship, allowing it to fight as normal. Admiral Lawrence, who had led the campaign at Summer, had the task of breaking through the SDS. Their initial arrival at the Zenith went well, but during the fight for the Dayron shipyards, one drone managed to slip through the net and destroy the SLS Terra Nova's CIC, killing the Admiral and his command staff. His deputy, Vice Admiral Santi Frelanda, took over and led the fleet to victory over Dayron, and then at the system's nadir. Meanwhile, the regular army was beginning the long surface battle. Over the course of the campaign, the entire 12th Army would be rotated to and from the world, which saw excessive use of WMDs. During this time, Jerome Blake and his team came to the planet to rebuild the HPG destroyed by General Yukai during the coup, the man Amaris subsequently dubbed the Butcher of Dayron shortly before executing him as a means to wash his hands of the failure there. Blake was almost killed when Imperial forces counterattacked, suffering some major wounds. This event added to his mythos, as the news circuits had characterized the actions of his team as those of noble adventurers hopping from world to world. During his time recuperating aboard SLS McKenna's Pride, he became firm friends with Kerensky, and the two spent many hours idealizing on how the Star League should look and operate in the future. The follow-on targets for the second wave began with a boon for the Star League Navy. Two worlds that had one time operated an SDS had since been redeployed. Furthermore, a trio of planets had the majority of their defenders and officials up and leave the second the SLDF materialized in system. At Kilborn, they were caught in orbit, forcing the survivors to return to the planet, only to suffer retaliatory nuclear strikes from the Hegemony Patriot forces on world. The latter surrendered immediately afterwards. Also during the summer of 2775, Carver 5 was finally declared pacified, though tragically, General Van der Kolk was killed in the closing stages and wouldn't live to see his planet liberated.
Let me make this perfectly clear, my Marines never once needed rescuing. Those assholes tried, and failed, to take us out when the fat bastard killed Richard Cameron. They tried again, and failed again, even with reinforcements. What they failed to realize was the resolve and training of a Star League Marine. We had almost 4,000 Marines on Quintico when those bastards came, along with another 5,000 SLDF personnel, from recruits to 40-year veterans. We had SDS batteries, heavy armor, battle mechs, and fighters. And we had the most powerful weapon the Star League ever leveraged, the support and trust of our citizens.
The second provincial capital targeted by the SLDF was Lockdale. Admiral Akayev Cameron had proven herself twice successful before, and was set to become the Navy's leading expert on anti-SDS tactics. To stop one unfortunate group of naval personnel having to suffer successive drone engagements, squadrons were regularly rotated between fleets. On September 11th, she led 4th Fleet through to a pirate point only 2 days from the world, allowing her to pick off the defense stations and smaller drone fleet in orbit, while the Caspers at the standard jump points raced to meet her. Again, the Nike warships were the main target for the drones, leading High Command to suspect that the operators were studying after-action reports from the prior battles, and altering the drone priority list to account for the new countermeasure. The rest of the drones reached her on the 16th, but by then she'd been reinforced by 3rd Army's escorts and scores of empty dropships. This time, the Admiral employed a new strategy of alternating which of her jammers were active at fast intervals, confusing the drones into switching between targets and improving the survivability of those vital Nike warships. Vice Admiral Els Cainero was dispatched to secure the jump point shipyards while the regular army made landfall on the 25th. The liberal use of WMDs employed by Amaris's troops did not slow the relentless pace of General Jack Lucas's advance, and despite the heavy cost, victory was won at Lockdale in just 5 months. The Leiden Commonwealth's Operation Ulmerich had been running concurrently with the Star League's effort to reclaim the hegemony. Around 100 mixed LCAF regiments participated in the invasion. The fledgling RIF Republican Army was in no state to withstand the attack. They concentrated what forces they had on key holdings such as Bucklands and Somerset, but despite a determined resistance, were ultimately overwhelmed. Many worlds were in urgent need of essentials, and so willingly gave themselves over to the more robust Lyran supply chain. Apollo itself was taken in September, after which the campaign continued for a few more months before Robert Steiner put a hold on further advances, as he turned his attention back towards the inner sphere. Mikhail Amaris resurfaced to lead what was left of the RRA in resistance, but there was no real hope of success. In total, some 70 planets had been taken, though this still left more than 100 unclaimed. Regardless, the outcome was clear. The once mighty Rimworld's Republic could not withstand 2 successive invasions, and after 525 years of growth, finally collapsed. The fate of the more distant colonies was in serious jeopardy. From the ashes arose the first of several new micronations, the Oberon Confederation. This trio of worlds aimed to keep the spirit of the Rimworlds alive, but surrounded as they were by bandit forces, they faced an uphill struggle. That December, Kerensky called for a meeting of High Command as he had the previous year. The assault on Alula Australis was just beginning, but this marked the final world within the hegemony not guarded by an SDS. It had been over 3 years since Operation Chieftain began, and Kerensky feared at their current pace it could be another 3 before they reached Earth, by which time precious little of the SLDF would remain, and morale would be shot. Around 50% of the Star League Defense Force's 2765 strength was now lost. At the Carver Conference, the Commanding General presented his plans to his assembled officers. Regardless of all other factors, 2776 would be the last year before the final assault on Terra. While High Command argued over the merits and pitfalls of that potential plan, the second wave was drawing to a conclusion with the attack on the third provincial capital, Tirfing. Santi Furlander had been promoted to full admiral after holding together Lawrence's fleet at Dayron, and now commanded the naval force assigned to Tirfing. Her fears over a similar fate to her predecessor caused her to arrive at the system's nadir with the majority of her SDS jammers active, something which posed little additional benefit, but would identify potential targets for the drones. After jumping to the zenith and employing similar tactics, which in turn led to heavy casualties among the Project Nightcraft, General Kim Solheim refused to support her in attacking the planet. Her complaints went right up the chain of command until they reached Kerensky. He in turn called for Vice Admiral Canero to hop across the command circuit to reach Tirfing as fast as possible and evaluate the situation. Els Canero took command and called in reinforcements from 12th Fleet before bringing the naval battle to a successful conclusion later that month. General Solheim's 5th Army made landfall on Christmas Eve, but the carnage wrought by Amaris troops using their full arsenal of WMDs left her organising humanitarian efforts before tracking down the perpetrators in mid-2776. High Command ultimately decided to support Kerensky in his plan to wrap up non-Terran operations in 2776. One issue they foresaw, though, was a lack of experience at the top levels of Naval Command. So far, only Akayev Cameron and their protégé Canero had proven themselves consistently successful, and so the next two targets would serve as a learning experience for their fellow admirals. The naval battles at Pollux and Epsilon Eridani played out in near identical fashion. On January 11th, 4th and 12th Fleets materialised at their respective systems' zenith and made short work of the drones in a brief hour-long clash, both employing marine boarders to great success. The reserve 5th and 16th Fleets arrived in system with Admirals Margray and Sukhanov providing escort to the regular army and observing proceedings. 3 days later, the lead admirals jumped to pirate points further in system and then made use of a new strategy to confuse the drones. Hastily modified warships began broadcasting signals at every possible frequency, not with any serious hope of disrupting the SDS, but rather to disguise the identities of the Project Nike vessels. They paid dearly for the ruse as they became priority targets themselves, but ultimately this helped reduce casualties of the rare but essential jammers. Afterwards, the reserve fleets employed the same tactics at the system's nadir jump points. Aggressive regular army deployments on the two worlds kept the use of more extreme tactics from the defenders to a minimum, sparing the lives of many civilians at the cost of higher casualties among the regular army. With Akayev Cameron now withdrawing to take an active role in planning the final operations against Earth, Admirals Canero, Margray and Sukhanov moved on to their next targets, looking for their respective 4th, 3rd and 2nd victories over the dreaded space defense systems.
When Joseph Cameron first proposed the idea of the Marshall Olympiad, it was first and foremost a display of the Star League's military prowess and as a way to promote esprit de corps within the SLDF. That it also proved to be a powerful recruitment tool and popular entertainment for the masses was a secondary benefit. Originally, the war games were held on Mars up to the dawn of the 28th century, after which it transitioned to the planet outreach. While the competition was as popular as ever, the rot at the heart of the Star League was beginning to show through. By the time of the last Marshall Olympiad in 2736, the event was something of a farce, serving as nothing more than a way for the countless arms manufacturers to hawk their wares to an increasingly paranoid Commanding General Rebecca Fetlandral. This final event would also play host to the first meeting of two of history's most infamous individuals, when Fetlandral's deputy Alexander Kerensky first met the future president of the Rimworld's Republic, Stefan Amaris. In fact, it was Stefan's disgust at what the Marshall Olympiad had become that reinforced the idea in his head that the Star League deserved to be put out of his misery.
Outreach, as the site of the fabled Marshall Olympiad throughout the 28th century, was a system that the SLDF was intimately acquainted with. This counted in their favour during the brief campaign that summer. Despite being a former stronghold for Kerensky's faction, most of the useful equipment and population had long since been carried off by the Empire, meaning it was a somewhat hollow victory. When the Star League Navy arrived at Graham, they materialised right into an ambush orchestrated by Major Herman Boyle of the AEAF. He and his squadron had spent months making the entire system almost impassable by liberally spreading mines throughout all known jump points and likely approaches towards the inhabited 4th planet. After overcoming the space defense system, Admiral Margray had to call a halt to proceedings until Boyle's aerospace fighters could be found and eliminated. The hidden dropship from which they had been operating was eventually located, and the Major was taken prisoner. In a twist of fate, the ship aboard which he was being held collided with one of his mines, breaching Herman's cell and sucking Boyle out into space. Margray now turned her attention to launching successive orbital strikes against the defenders. Unfortunately, he could do little to prevent what would become one of the most widespread use of nuclear weapons seen during the campaign. Procyon fared slightly better, but the civilian population had been suffering from the depredations of the Amaris government for a decade, and the planet was a shadow of its former self. Of the two key objectives Sukhanov had hoped to capture, the shipyards were partially destroyed in the fighting, and the colossal Fort Lazak aerospace complex was deemed too costly to clear, and so had to be razed by orbital fire in order to eliminate the strong AEAF presence there. Clearing the castles Brian took several months, during which time the SLDF was subjected to repeated WMD strikes. The third wave had begun well, and now the three task forces sought to end it with 5 more successive victories. The worlds targeted were some of the closest to Terra, and it would soon become abundantly clear to the Empire that the SLDF was planning to bypass several planets in a straight drive for Earth. To prevent this from happening, small teams of operatives were smuggled onto the planets with orders to disable the HPGs as Amaris had done during his coup a decade earlier. This would prevent word from getting out and hopefully give the Star League an edge during the opening minutes of the final battle. Of the 5 targeted worlds, Sirius provided the least challenge. After several failed attempts to get the mining colony restarted after Amaris' troops had destroyed the orbital facilities during the coup, eventually Commanding General Scoffins had called for the near-complete recall of the system's SDS. When the Star League reached the surface, the few survivors that hadn't starved to death were deeply resentful that it had taken them 10 years to come to their aid. Rigel Cantorus hid similar horrors. Industrial productivity hadn't dropped off to the same degree as elsewhere in the Empire, but this was found to be because the workers' families were being held hostage at detention camps. Many tens of thousands had died, their bodies then incinerated to erase the evidence. Upon arrival, the Amaris regulars used nuclear weapons to destroy the camps before they could be liberated. Sukhanov and Kenero worked in tandem to break through the SDS at Keed. At one time, this had been a central hub for the entire Star League Navy, and the admirals and ship captains put their local knowledge to good effect. The Omicron II shipyards were one of the largest within the hegemony, and a key target for both Amaris during this coup and now Admiral Janos Grek. Sadly, hidden nuclear devices detonated them when approached, but the civilian population on Weld was largely spared from the same. Nevertheless, it was a populace that was decidedly pro-Amaris, even at this late stage in the war, and so final victory only came well into 2777. 4th Fleet was temporarily handed over to Vice Admiral Robert Evans. While he was taking CAF's Nadir jump point, Markray focused on the Zenith, before the two quick jumped to the planet itself, just as word was reaching them that they were under attack. What had once been a strongly pro-Amaris world had since risen up in resistance. Duchess Confalonieri's decision to sell out to the new emperor had come back to haunt her in 2768, when she was assassinated by an angry local. This added further fuel to the resistance, leading to an increased HSF presence. The HPG station was handled by the locals, but the secret police forced the large population to resist the Star League liberators, often by holding their families hostage. New Earth was something of a homecoming for Admiral Dimitrios Rumlow. After successfully defending the system during the coup, he had since been commanding the Secret Fleet throughout Amaris' occupation. Now he returned at the head of 9th Fleet to battle the SDS using his own unique strategies developed during his exile. Unfortunately, he discovered on arrival that the HPG team had failed in their mission to bring the station offline, and so he quickly switched to his backup strategy. 3 civilian dropships that had worked with him for the past decade, now converted to fire a deadly barrage of naval-grade missiles, launched their payload at the facility, destroying the compound and isolating the world. Sadly, they did not escape the wrath of the SDS. The Admiral made the drone operators pay for it by first destroying the 2 fleets guarding the jump points. 4th Fleet arrived from CAF to assist with the more distant facilities scattered throughout the system, while Rumlow jumped to a Lagrange point above New Earth. Here, he maneuvered to the very edge of the planet's atmosphere and lured the drones in. Several were sucked in and fell to the surface.
The vile actions of the mercenary units in Amaris' employ, such as the Burning Tigers and the Greenhaven Gestapo, had won them the animosity of the SLDF. They could expect little quarter to be given once they were finally tracked down. The Empire, however, was more than happy to utilize their services and made continued use of both large mercenary divisions as well as single mech warriors for hire. One individual had earned his reputation for executing wounded soldiers was Jose Magellan. While a proven killer, the Imperials never fully trusted the sadistic mech pilot and so riding shotgun with him was always a RimWorld's officer to ensure loyalty. When the regular army landed on New Earth, Jose launched his initial ambush from within a hospital before using the experimental null signature system aboard his Thug to lose his pursuers. Further traps laid by Magellan cost the lives of several more mech warriors before he was finally captured. When they removed him from the cockpit, they found the body of the RimWorld officer shot dead by the mercenary for seemingly no other reason than he wanted to stop the killing. The Provisional Justice Courts sentenced him to death soon afterwards.
The ground campaign took a heavy toll on both the SLDF and civilian populace alike. New Earth has never fully recovered from the damage sustained during the Empire's desperate final stand. Their loss at New Earth also marked yet another break in Amaris' psyche. In his paranoid state, he ordered the Terran HPG stations at Geneva and Tacoma destroyed, fearing that they would serve as entry points for SLDF electronic warfare. Regardless, with the eventual fall of these 5 worlds, the path towards Terra was clear. Campaigns against the provincial capital of Terra Firma, along with the Epsilon Indi, Thorin and Zolokothin systems, were all suspended. The time had come to deal with Amaris. Preparations for the final assault had been going on throughout the year. The 10 army groups were moved up to staging posts surrounding the Terran system, while the fleets prepared for what would go down as the largest naval battle in history. Kerensky took stock of his situation. Of those forces that had begun Operation Chieftain, the regular army had sustained casualties equaling a third of their strength, and the Navy had suffered an abhorrent 50% survival rate. Compared to their 2765 figures, 65% of the SLDF had been destroyed. There were other threats facing Kerensky too. The predations of the member states had been temporarily curtailed, but it seemed likely that they would try to seize worlds for themselves again once the final assault was underway. Furthermore, there were still several planets suffering from active insurgencies. Lastly, those bypass worlds might dispatch their drone fleets to attack from the rear. To deal with this last point, a quartet of squadrons were broken off to act as a quick response fleet stationed at Keed and New Earth. The commanding general also established the 99th Army Group to serve as a garrison force, with 17 donor divisions and 19 independents coming from the other corps to meet that requirement. One fact about the upcoming assault distressed High Command greatly. There was serious doubt over whether the SDS jammers developed by Project Nike would work. The Reagan space defense system that guarded Terra was more advanced, not to mention much larger, than any other. Back in Jonathan Cameron's day, Vice Admiral Ifat Navvi had worked on fortifying the SDS against electronic countermeasures. Her work was never expanded to other systems, but Terra demanded the best. Now, the former Director of Communications was going to play an indirect part in making the Terran assault the bloodiest in the Navy's history. Gathering intelligence from the Terran system was extremely hazardous. The sheer number of drones allowed for many to be hidden among the outer reaches at known Lagrangian jump points, some even within the Kuiper belt. These would emerge to hunt down any craft that was unfortunate enough to materialize nearby and not have the means of immediately jumping back to safety. Nevertheless, by 2776, the Starleague had reliable intel on the scale of the defences. Approximately 300 Casper drones were gathered around the key worlds and installations. Hundreds more M3 drones complemented them, along with more than 1,000 Void Seekers. Each of the standard jump points had 5 large defense stations waiting to engage the Starleague, and a handful of Pavese battle stations were spread between Venus, Mars, and Earth. The former 2 would be secondary targets during the attack, but the focus was getting the regular army to Earth as quickly as possible. Even after dispatching the drones, 120 ground batteries, and many more on the near side of Luna, would resist the landings and prevent warship support. Once they reached the ground, the regular army would have to face their strongest opposition yet. The Amaris Empire armed forces had begun life as those loyal troops within the Rimworld's army, bolstered by huge numbers of mercenaries. After the coup, a wave of pro-Amaris civilians had volunteered with the Hegemony Patriots, and this was later expanded through the widespread use of conscription. A decade in control of the Hegemony had allowed the Empire to gain a strong foothold within the many military academies. In recent years, there had been several waves of professional graduates loyal to the Empire joining the ranks of the AEAF. Commanding General Patrick Scoffins had spent the last 5 years reorganising the armed forces, which had grown to 60 divisions. That number belies the reality that this was far from the Empire's military peak. First of all, 19 of those were hegemony patriots, poorly trained grunt infantry of dubious loyalty. The rest were formed around a single mech regiment, along with several brigades of supporting conventional forces, which the besieged Empire found it easier to source. Battle mech production within the hegemony had never matched the Starleague figures, with the military forced to use whatever it could get its hands on. The Dragoon was the only new design produced in any noteworthy numbers, but it was never common. As the war dragged on, far too much time was spent in search of a silver bullet to beat Kerensky, with follies such as the infamous 110-ton Mata, the work of the Emperor's cousin Rifkin Amaris, achieving nothing but wasting precious time and resources.
Taking possession of the Terran industrial base gave Amaris the ability to construct mechs equivalent to those within the SLDF's Royal Regiments. Their first action was to bring any stockpiles they found into service with the armed forces, while also refitting older designs, such as the homegrown Rampage, with new technology. The Amaris Empire Armed Forces also discovered several new designs awaiting full production, which they commenced immediately. The Jackrabbit was the first new battle mech to see action. Tests had shown it was a reliable and easy-to-maintain chassis that packed significant firepower for a light mech, but real-world engagements would quickly reveal the flaws in the design, which is namely that it is under-armored and lacking in maneuverability, something which the SLDF was quick to exploit. Some 500 were produced in total, but only a fraction of these would survive until the end of the conflict. Another design of note coming into service in 2771 was the Dragoon. This was the Empire's effort to streamline its forces by building a mech that could have its weapons payload easily swapped out to a variety of configurations, allowing it to fulfill a number of different mission roles. Originally, this design philosophy would be employed across the entirety of the Amaris Empire Armed Forces, in tanks, aerospace fighters, and battle mechs. But the onset of Operation Chieftain meant that only the Dragoon would enter production. The standard weapons complement featured a trio of hard-hitting weapons, making it a dangerous opponent for the SLDF, but thankfully it was a relatively rare sight on the battlefield. Those few hundred Dragoons Krupp-Stellar technologies produced were most often given to the elite of the AEAF, the majority of whom were gathering on Terra and had yet to see action. In addition to the Empire's new Dragoon chassis, several experimental prototypes were assembled in the final years of the war, most famously the super-heavy Matar, otherwise known as Amaris' Folly, but also the Quad Gauss Rifleman 3 and the Screamer Land Air Mech.
The SLDF was in no better shape. The days of whole single chassis companies and battalions were long gone, and now they were a hodgepodge of disparate designs, forced to resort to whatever equipment they could salvage or buy at a discount. At one time, a battle mech division could field 2 whole brigades of mechs. Now they were lucky if they could find those numbers within a corps. At the end of the day, irrespective of all the lies told by the paper TOEs, Kerensky reckoned he had a 3-to-1 advantage, something which Operation Persuasive Force 2 decades earlier had taught him would be just barely enough. On September 9th, Admiral Grech decided it was time to learn whether their fears were based in reality. A 10-warship flotilla, including several Nike vessels, jumped to far-distant Eris within the Terran system, where they lured a single Casper into engaging them. Even this isolated drone showed none of the normal effects observed when the SDS jammers were active, and it didn't seem likely that the coordination between swarms would be hampered either. The complacent Rear Admiral was caught off guard by the performance of the enhanced Casper, losing one of his ships and several others taking heavy damage. Operation Liberation, as High Command dubbed the return to Earth, would commence early the next year. The plan was remarkably simple. Minus those few units on rearguard action, the entire SLDF would jump into either the Zenith or Nadir at quick 5-minute intervals. Though it was risky having them arrive so close in time, strength in numbers would be their best defense. General Skrek would command the Zenith fleet, while Joan Brandt would head the Nadir assault. Both would burn hard for Earth, aiming to arrive simultaneously. There, they would focus their entire landing on the Eurasian continent, so as to only expose themselves to 30 of the STS ground batteries. The operation could call upon just under 1,500 regiments and around 900 warships. Even at this late hour, no other military in the Inner Sphere, either at that point in history or in the centuries since, could stand against such a force. The Amaris Empire had only a fraction of that. Eventual victory seemed a foregone conclusion, but it would come at the cost of tens of thousands of lives. On October 21st, Commanding General Alexander Kerensky called for the Emperor to surrender. His brief, 500-word demand stated that the imperial government and its military would receive a fair trial under Stalig civil law. Refuse, and he could not guarantee those same promises. The response came 3 days later. In it, Emperor Stefan Amaris ranted and raved for over 10 hours, likening the general to every form of hellspawn conceivable. Kerensky quickly dismissed his opponent's ramblings and prepared for war. In 2759, in a ceremony kept secret from the rest of the Inner Sphere, Alexander Kerensky married former aerospace pilot Katusha Ludmilova. 5 years later, they celebrated the birth of their first son, Nicholas. After a brief return home at the height of the Periphery Uprising, Kerensky would not see his wife again for over 10 years, and had never once set eyes on his second son, Andrei. Since then, the world as he knew it had collapsed. Now, he was returning at the head of the largest military in human history, determined that he would see them again. On January 14, 2777, the go order was given, with the first ships reporting ready at their stations a week later. J-hour was set for January 23, 1612 Terra Standard Time. The long-awaited moment had come, and for all involved, it was victory or death. At each of the standard Terran jump points, 10 civilian vessels appeared in unison. The waiting quintet of Pavese battle stations gave them the standard 60 seconds to transmit clearance codes or risk annihilation. The jump ships were abandoned, however, their automated arrival the first step of Operation Barbican. Each had immediately decoupled their similarly automated trio of Overlord dropships, which turned and raced towards the stations. Within 15 seconds those crews had opened fire, obliterating the transports, but with growing fear they realised the dropships were not altering their collision trajectories. 2/3 of the Overlords were destroyed, but it was not enough to save them. At 90 seconds, the ships collided, their holds packed with explosives. 6 defence stations were destroyed outright, the others crippled beyond repair. Within 5 minutes, the 12 observer craft that had jumped further out reported back to Kerensky on the situation. A squadron was dispatched to both Zenith and Nadir to finish off the survivors, but stumbled straight into Amaris' Calthrop contingency. Asteroids towed into position nearby were detonated, showering the jump points with debris. They waited for most of the space trash to pass harmlessly by before proceeding with Operation Liberation. but they would still have to contend with those pieces that had come to rest within the arrival zones. 45 minutes after J-hour, the first fleets appeared. They had only 5 minutes to clear the area before the next was set to arrive. To get all 20 through took a further hour. 12 vessels suffered damage from the debris, but miraculously only one ship, the Volga-class SLS Richardson, was destroyed when the Vincent-class SLS Mississippi Queen materialized inside its bow. 18 others had failed to depart, but in total there were now almost 900 warships split between Zenith and Nadir. As they came through, the squadrons moved into position for their approach to Earth. At the heart of the two armadas were the precious transports, mostly Potemkin and Volga-class vessels. Operation Liberation was the final stage they had all been working towards, and it was dependent on enough of the regular army making it to the ground. The Stalag Navy knew that they would have to be prepared to give their ships and their lives to have any hope of success. Around them formed the inner layer of escort and fire support squadrons, while the outer layer was comprised of the line and interdictor squadrons. Pursuit and recon squadrons were arranged in pickets or held in reserve, while thousands of aerospace fighters and assault dropships sped between the larger vessels.
The heart of the SLDF fleet had always been the glorious, if now largely lost, McKenna class. Starting in 2652, the McKenna-class battleship was a Martian product from Blue Nose Clipper ships. Despite their insane complexity and obscene cost, a total of 280 McKennas were made, at a rate of 2 per year prior to the war. The McKenna was the yardstick of strategic problem solving for 2 reasons. 1, it was the heaviest armament in a warship at that time. Armed with 12 naval autocannons, 48 heavy naval PPCs, 10 missile tubes, and 12 naval lasers, the McKenna is a statement that the SLDF Leviathan was alive and well. Carrying 750 crew, and capable of hauling 6 dropships plus 50 fighters and additional bays for whatever was needed, the McKenna was almost certainly the biggest stick of the Starlake. But it had a secret weapon, which made it perhaps the most formidable vessel of all time. It wasn't its ferrocarbide armor, or its sustained acceleration of 2.5 Gs. It was, in fact, that some McKenna-class vessels were very specialized. These vessels were not designed to fight you with the vessel's formidable weapons, but rather with the entire fleet at the same time. These specialized McKenna-class vessels often served as direct command and control platforms, if not strategic relays, for SLDF expeditionary forces, and the McKenna's Pride was the very best of them. The SLS McKenna's Pride led the SLDF Command Squadron and also served as component of the 3 line ship squadrons within the SLDF First Fleet. Leading from the front, and frequently in the thick of things, McKenna's Pride was, in my humble opinion, the best command ship ever made. And yet, it was one of only 6 ever constructed for the Herculean task of leading the largest military yet made. And sadly, it was the only one to survive the Ameri-Civil War. The McKenna's enduring legacy proves a point. They sure as hell don't make them like they used to.
With the fleets assembled, they began the journey towards Earth. As they departed, drones from the outer reaches moved to intercept. For the first 48 hours, they shadowed the armada, occasionally sacrificing a drone or two in a mad lunge into the heart of the formation, gathering data on how the SLN squadrons would fight. As the number of pursuers increased, the pickets were drawn back and the armadas pulled tighter together in anticipation. The Reagan space defense system, mighty as it was, could not hope to destroy even one of the 2 fleet groups approaching Terra. But then, that would never have been their goal. Emperor Amaris would gladly have sacrificed the entire array just to eliminate the vulnerable transports carrying the bulk of the SLDF. Kerensky needed to ensure that that didn't happen, and he turned to the brave crews of Task Force Leonidas to do it. 3 days into the operation, SLS Chieftain, née RWS Terrans Amaris, the last of the great battleships constructed by the Rimworld's Republic, led the 40 warships of Task Force Leonidas from the Tau Ceti system to a pirate point in Mars orbit. Their proximity to Earth demanded an immediate response from the Empire. Gradually, more and more Casper drones began to move into range. 30 had assembled by the third hour when SLS Europa let loose with the first of its nuclear warhead-equipped missiles. A dozen were destroyed in an instant, but the ship had made itself a priority target for the survivors. Nevertheless, when Europa finally met its end, some 40 Caspers had already been destroyed. Leonidas was armed with the majority of the SLDF's remaining nuclear stockpile. They had no desire to use such weapons on Earth, and the drones were perfect targets for the deadly weapons. Over the next few hours, another 10 were destroyed, but those had managed to focus their efforts on the warships damaged in the earlier engagements, taking 5 more crews to their graves. 10 hours after the task force arrived, the drones attacked en masse, destroying a further 8 vessels. By the end of the first day, those numbers were up to 21 warships lost, but they had succeeded in drawing 25% of the Caspers in system away from the approaching fleets. Early on the 28th, 2 crews were forced to scuttle their limping vessels, escaping on lifeboats to become the only survivors of the suicide mission. Task Force Leonidas made its final stand later that afternoon. 60 Caspers had amassed to destroy the last 17 warships. A half-dozen hours into the carnage, only 6 remained alive. One by one they dropped, until the SLS Sovetski Soyuz, the lead ship of its class and last survivor of the task force, went out in a blaze of glory. Almost all 8,000 of the servicemen involved in the battle perished, but their sacrifice had saved the lives of entire divisions stuck aboard their dropships. Leonidas had succeeded in destroying 106 Caspers in total, almost 40% of the entire Reagan space defense system. 36 hours from Earth, the 2 armadas began their deceleration phase. Each was being tailed by around 150 drones, half of which were Caspers. The picket squadrons were again sent out, many into the face of certain doom, but all in the hope of keeping the main body of the assault force safe during their most vulnerable moments. For 24 hours, the crews waited at their stations, poised and ready to return fire. The knowledge that their end could come at any second was exhausting. The drones, not bound by the constraints of the human body, could pull maneuvers that would crush any occupants within. They chose this moment to attack. Janos Grek's fleet faced the worst odds. 100 Caspers boosted at full speed towards him, while 60 did the same against Joan Brandt on the opposite side of the system. Immediately, the 2 admirals deployed their full complement of fighters and dropships to intercept, but they ran straight into the many smaller drones providing escort. 100 M3s, more than 700 Void Seekers intercepted Grek's force, even more against the Nadir team, inflicting devastating losses. Nevertheless, the pilots did what they could, managing to eliminate over 15% of the Caspers before they came into range. 12 hours out from Earth, the warships opened up. The combined firepower unleashed in those moments is unmatched by anything else in recorded history. As expected, the Caspers made a beeline for the transports, but with weight of numbers on the side of the SLDF, the depth of their defense served them well. 6 hours into the carnage, the Professor had managed to destroy 75% of his attackers. Though he had lost more than 600 aerospace fighters and more than 100 warships, crucially, only 15 transports had been destroyed. The damaged vessels in his fleet were actually moving to shield the vulnerable dropships at the core of their formation, using their hulls as a form of ablative armour. Brandt had been even more successful, losing only 5 transports, of which 2 had managed to evacuate their passengers before destruction. 2 hours before touchdown, the last of the drones were eliminated. 196 warships had been destroyed between the 2 fleets, equivalent to almost half of those losses sustained during the first 5 years of Operation Chieftain. 27 transports were lost, 18 full divisions. In just 10 hours, the SLDF had suffered almost 100,000 servicemen killed in action. Over the next 60 minutes, they engaged and destroyed the handful of Pavese and smaller orbital stations, leaving them only one last layer of defense to get through. While a detachment of warships moved to destroy the emplacements on Luna, more than 1,000 dropships, shuttles and fighters descended into orbit to engage the 30 ground batteries of the space defense system spread across Eurasia. Project Nike had been proven ineffective against the upgraded drones, but they activated their SDS jammers in the vague hope it would provide the orbiting fleet some measure of additional protection from the ground defences. A third of those pilots dropping towards the planet were on defensive duties, and they soon had their hands full as thousands of Imperial craft rose up to meet them. Among the defenders was one of the Empire's newest prototypes, the Screamer land air mech, one of the heaviest lambs ever designed. The anti-air defences over the SDS arrays were formidable. SLDF pilots had to use every trick at their disposal in order to get through, and often that still wasn't enough. One by one though, the batteries were being knocked out. The first boots on the ground belonged to the Special Armed Services. Special Forces Command had dispatched 6 shuttle-borne teams to those emplacements that air units would not be able to bring down, while 5 more made their halo drops from 39,000 meters, punching through the upper atmosphere aboard one-man drop pods, before free-falling all but the last few hundred meters. The first hour saw 24 of the SDS batteries destroyed, while 5 more sustained heavy damage. Kerensky tasked a warship squadron with destroying the troublesome Himalayan complex, the SLS Heidelberg raising the Kumbu array 6 hours later. Behind them, the surprise launch of 18 M3 drones from hidden lunar hangars ambushed the exhausted fleets, destroying a pair of Vincent-class corvettes and the SLS Van Hoch, the last of the Luxor-class heavy cruisers in the Navy, before the drones themselves were destroyed. Another SLDF loss came when they attempted to widen their control over Earth orbit by eliminating the South American STS sites. The SAS loaded 6 of their elite Fury teams into specially equipped Serrano VTOLs and flew them low across the Atlantic. Unfortunately, all were intercepted in the air, encouraging High Command to focus their attention on Eurasia for the time being. More than 1,000 aerospace fighters had been destroyed up to this point, a staggering 40% of the Star League's entire arsenal. Of the pilots who had taken part in Operation Liberation, 25% were dead. Despite their fatigue, those pilots continued to fly missions throughout the landings. The Sovietsky Soyuz-class SLS White Cloud, the winner of the final Marshall Olympiad, launched fighter sorties non-stop for 48 hours until they were finally taken off the line. The Empire had paid dearly for it. Almost 4,000 of their fighters had been taken out, including the outclassed Screamer Lamb. The first wave of 32 divisions, totaling some 150,000 troops and 14,000 mechs, had been plummeting towards Earth throughout the melee, and were now moments from making landfall. Pathfinder units were making orbital drops at each of the landing sites, spearheaded by the Independence and leading battle mech divisions. The very first to touch down belonged to the George S. Patton division at Gagarin. The original plan had called for landings at Beijing, Berlin, Moscow, and New Delhi, to quickly overwhelm the defenders within those cities, but ultimately, High Command settled on a different strategy. The 10 army groups that had fought together throughout Operation Chieftain would continue to operate as independent battle groups on Earth. They were assigned landing sites across Eurasia, tasked primarily with securing as much territory as possible and establishing transport links across the entire continent. Attacking the Amanist strongholds would come later. This dispersion was meant to minimize the risk of strategic weapons being used against them. For the most part, they landed just outside their targeted cities, but with one notable exception. Sandhurst Royal Military Academy, first of the 3 academies within the War Triad, the most prestigious military schools in the entire Inner Sphere, and site of one of the 8 Castles Bryan in Eurasia, was the Empire's command headquarters for the entire European theatre, and the Black Prince Division was plunging straight into the heart of the complex. Crashing to Earth within just 3 square kilometers, the Royal Unit immediately established an aggressive offensive position from their field HQ near the lower lake. The 7th Amaris Fusiliers had withdrawn from the academy, but General Gunther Julian was not stunned for long. Reinforced by the 5th Hegemony Patriots, his forces counterattacked, pushing the outnumbered SLDF vanguard into a tenuous position. Only the timely arrival of reinforcements, landed at safer positions outside the base, forced the Imperial troops to pull back. By the end of the first day, the initial wave of landings was complete. Only the landing sites in Manchuria were attacked, but the opposition was short-lived. Scouts were already moving towards their primary targets, with larger formations preparing behind them. That evening, Commanding General Alexander Kerensky himself would take to the field aboard his signature Orion battlemech and lead 17th Army in the liberation of his home city of Moscow.
One of the regiments making landfall at Gagarin was the elite 14th Royal Can Marines. With them was a young lieutenant, Absalom Truscott, on one of his first deployments. He had graduated at the top of his class and earned a place in the prestigious unit. In the opening days of Operation Liberation, the Marines ran into an ambush as they approached the Russian capital. The lieutenant's natural skills in mech warfare saved his life, but the rest of his regiment was destroyed. Rather than let him sit by the wayside, Kerensky absorbed Truscott into his escort, and he fought alongside the commanding general throughout the battle for Moscow. Later postings to various HQ positions would give him a breadth of knowledge before he was reassigned by Lieutenant General Antonius Zalman back to Kerensky's side to command his bodyguard unit, where the now Major Truscott served with distinction through to the war's end.
To review the ground campaigns, we'll begin in the east, where the Japan battle group was descending at opposite ends of the archipelago. They faced 6 divisions and a strong Japanese militia. On Kyushu, 20th Army had a stroke of luck when they discovered that a training exercise between the 5th Amaris Legionnaires and local militia had descended into an actual battle. The Westmoreland Division soon involved themselves, establishing a ceasefire with the militia and pursuing the Legionnaires back to Mount Kimpusen, where they surrendered on February 4th. They spent the rest of the month securing the island, while the 22nd Amaris Chasseurs withdrew to Shimonoseki. On Hokkaido, 8th Army quickly realized saboteurs were trying to prevent a crossing at Tsugaru Strait. They had already destroyed the causeway and were in the process of setting demolitions within the Saikan Tunnel. The fast actions of the 28th Light Horse allowed them to sprint through the tunnel and secure the detonators on the far side. The rest of the army secured Hokkaido and then crossed to Honshu. 8th Army set about securing the northern cities, while scouts rushed ahead to find enemy troop concentrations. On February 19th, they ran into more determined militia at Sendai. They had dug in at the Hirose River and held back the SLDF for 4 days until withdrawing to a secondary line at the Notori River. Artillery spotters in the nearby mountains called in strikes, while a flanking force secured Iwanuma to the south. The militia fought valiantly in a desperate breakout attempt, but eventually surrendered on March 3rd. Sendai became the base of operations for 8th Army. The Malaysia battle group had just a single army to achieve its objectives. The 19th Amaris Dragoons had withdrawn to Singapore and left the defence of the Ipoh Castle Bryan to the 16th Hegemony Patriots. While the Quinton Division were besieging the compound, another division was dispatched to Kuala Lumpur, taking the capital without firing a shot. The 218th Battlemech managed to force their way inside the Castle Bryan by the end of the first week, forcing the Patriots to withdraw up the Malay Peninsula. Most of the army was headed south towards the fortified Johor Strait. The 19th Amaris Dragoons were able to hold back several attempts to cross before the SLDF finally established a beachhead on February 8th. By the 10th, the western half of the island was secure, and by the 19th, the Dragoons were trapped between the river and harbour. General Win Huang expected them to fall back to Sentosa Island, but instead they raced east towards the Changi spaceport, inadvertently crashing through an SLDF field hospital in the process. None of the Dragoons were allowed to escape after that. The largest battle group of Operation Liberation was assigned to Northern Asia. The majority of these forces would move down the coast, clearing eastern China, while the rest moved up towards the Arctic. At the far northwest of the continent, 12th Army had landed with 1,500 mech warriors and over 20,000 infantry. Their main opponent was not the solitary East Siberian Defense Regiment, but rather the cold, which at times dipped as low as -70 degrees. Landings were split between Yakutsk and Magadan, with their primary objective to secure the Russian end of the Bering Strait. Alaska seemed a probable entry point when it came time for the North American campaign, so Kerensky attempted to capture the transoceanic tunnels to aid in that endeavour. Unfortunately, saboteurs had already detonated all 10 tunnels, including those that ran through Iceland. Instead, 12th Army set about building infrastructure that would help arriving troops transit Siberia. The rest of the Northern Asia battle group landed in Manchuria. The Zarpita Division touched down at Shenyang and secured the city for 16th Army after the third day. From there, they moved to take the surrounding cities and advanced onto the Korean peninsula. 13th Army, spearheaded by the Punjab Pass Division, focused on Harbin. Only a single brigade opposed them, which steadily gave ground. This was a ruse, though, to draw the SLDF in. At the spaceport, the Flying Nuns had seconds to celebrate an easy victory before a nuclear detonation wiped out almost the entire division. Over the next few days, several more strategic rounds were fired by militia artillery, but all were intercepted in the air and their launch sites destroyed. The militia's fanatical defense of Harbin would see the greatest use of WMDs during the first year of the campaign, though thankfully only one would detonate. The 308th pressed ahead, and by February 5th, the Imperial forces had fled across the Xianghua River. As soon as they cleared the city, warships overhead opened fire, killing the defenders to the last man.
The Corps of Engineers played an essential role in Operation Liberation. Their list of tasks were wide-ranging, from construction to bomb disposal. One particularly notable action came at Harbin, when the withdrawing militia demi-brigade rigged a nuclear weapon to detonate after they crossed the Songhua River. Thankfully, the military engineers were on hand and able to disarm the device. Less headline-grabbing but arguably more important to the war effort was the construction efforts going on within eastern Siberia. The SLDF had determined that this would be a major staging post for the majority of the regular army once the time came to move against North America. Unfortunately, the infrastructure in the region was sorely lacking. The Corps of Engineers spent 2777 fortifying the Trans-Siberian maglev tracks and road network to handle the anticipated increase in traffic and to protect it against air raids launched out of Alaska by the 88th Amaris Fusiliers. While their duty wasn't glorious, individuals like Cyrus Elam, who was fiercely loyal to Kerensky after his family had been killed during the Amaris coup, still earned a great deal of respect within the SLDF.
To the west, the China battle group had made a heavily dispersed landing across the Gobi Desert. 2nd Army landed to the west and split itself in two. The Denabola Division and Hellraisers from Heaven pushed north into Mongolia. Ulaanbaatar had become a haven for those pro-Amaris forces who had fought in the Periphery Uprising and were less than pleased to see the SLDF. Despite local resistance, the capital was taken in short order. The rest of 2nd Army headed south into sparsely populated western China. 19th Army, meanwhile, was heading southeast to secure the northern Chinese districts in February, then began preparing for a confrontation at Xi'an. The two armies assigned to the Indian subcontinent would have the greatest number of civilians to liberate. Mercifully, the three Amaris divisions in the region were relatively spread out, and so could be dealt with individually. The India battle group worked in concert to liberate Jaipur. Both made landfall south of the city and promptly ran into partisan resistance. The entire Rajasthan district was on the verge of revolt, which threatened to spread across the rest of the Indian subcontinent. Defending the city were 11 conventional militia regiments from the pro-Amaris training camp. Taking that complex became the primary objective, which they achieved on February 7th. The militia was gradually pushed back into the old town, turning the battle into an all-infantry affair. The last survivors attempted to flee north, but were caught at Mansagar Lake on February 18th. Most surrendered, but a few made it to the Amber Fort and fought to the last. The Central Asia battle group faced perhaps the most diverse environments during their campaign on Terra, from frozen Siberia to the scorching Middle East. They landed as one outside Astana, just north of the main opposition in the region. The Graham Division secured the city in short order, while the rest of 3rd Army advanced into the Urals. The Screaming Eagles and New Earth Division led 4th Army south to Baikonur, the largest freight spaceport on the continent. A 2-day battle with the 4th Amaris Legionnaires ensued, with a large portion of the spaceport destroyed during the fighting. The Imperial troops attempted to withdraw towards the Aral Sea, but were hunted down. Meanwhile, a detachment from 4th Army successfully liberated Ashgabat, Samarkand, and Tashkent. Western Russia was one of the most heavily industrialized regions on the planet, alongside Germany and eastern China. It was therefore a key strategic target. But on top of that, it held a personal significance for the commanding general. Kerensky had made landfall with one half of the Eastern Europe battle group at Gagarin. The 33rd American Dragoons and 9th Hegemony Patriots stood in the way of his reunion with his wife and children, and time was of the essence. The local Kryptia had been holding public executions in Moscow, as they had in many cities across Earth since the arrival of the SLDF in system. To slow their approach, saboteurs had destroyed many of the bridges along the Moskva River, but the cold winter left it safe for infantry and light armour to cross the ice and construct pontoon bridges where needed, supported by the jump-equipped mechs of the East Hartford Division. As 11th Army approached, the Clockwork and North American divisions, led by Major General James McEvedy, flanked around to the north to secure the main escape road, while the Blue Star Division did the same south of Moscow. On February 11th, Kerensky's task force entered the city. The Hegemony Patriot defense at the Outer Ring Road was quickly overrun, but as they approached the Moskva River, the Dragoons launched an assault down Tikhonov Avenue. By the 15th, SLDF reinforcements had driven them back, and they were again advancing into the Arbat and Yakimanka districts. The next day, the commander of the Patriots personally surrendered to Kerensky at Bolotnya Square. The Dragoons abandoned their headquarters at the Kremlin and fled east through the gap in the encirclement. This is exactly what Kerensky had planned for, hoping that they would leave Moscow if they saw a way out, and thus reduce civilian casualties. Outside the city, they ran headfirst into a pair of reserve divisions and were promptly surrounded by the entire army. They held their ground for 1 hour before they too called for surrender. Kerensky, however, had just witnessed the devastation of his hometown and was not inclined to accept their offer. The standoff lasted for 2 hours, the Dragoons certain of their impending doom, before the commanding general finally cooled and accepted their surrender. Kerensky now returned to Moscow on a personal mission. He and his bodyguard Jerome Winson led a small team of trusted officers to locate his family. Despite all the odds, their identities have remained a secret throughout the occupation, and Alexander was able to reunite with them for the first time in over a decade. Katusha Ludmilova had actually been an active part of the Moscow resistance, making her survival all the more extraordinary. The commanding general's family wasn't the only reunion in Moscow, as records suggest that Jerome Winson also found his younger sister Jennifer living nearby. 17th Army dispersed itself across several landing sites within Ukraine, taking aim at the Sverdlovsk Castle Bryan and the two major cities of Kiev and Odessa. The fight for the capital was relatively straightforward. Independent regiments landed along the main escape roads to the north, while the main task force approached from the south, spearheaded by the 16th Mechanized Infantry. Most of the defensive positions they found had been abandoned, and all but one regiment of militia laid down their arms. The western half of the city was secured by February 6th, and 4 days later, Kiev was liberated. From there, they headed northwest to regroup with elements of 11th Army, taking Minsk by the end of the month. The Outreach Division had landed at Mykolaiv. Turning east, they ran into opposition halfway to their objective, but managed to break through on the 5th. They faced a far greater challenge when they reached the bottleneck where rivers and lakes flowed into the Black Sea. The 422nd Amaris Cavaliers had chained Odessa's residents to the fortifications and emplacements along the coastal highway. Kerensky grimly ordered the advance despite the civilian cost, but General Al-Nasser instead devised a novel strategy to circumvent the defences. He sent his fastest units to flank far to the north around the lakes, while a pair of regiments submerged themselves in the Black Sea, emerging to strike at the Cavaliers' undefended rear. On February 14th, they succeeded in liberating Odessa, though much of the city had been devastated. At Sverdlovsk, the Chara Cossacks and Thai militia managed to secure the exits within the first 5 days, but the 21st Amaris Dragoons within would not give up its hold for months yet. With warships maneuvering overhead, the rest of the task force began heading east, back across the border into Russia, towards the site of one of the most infamous battles of World War II, the city formerly known as Stalingrad.
While fighting to liberate the Crimean Peninsula, 17th Army received unexpected aid from a rogue AEAF training battalion led by a former SLDF officer, Gerald McKinniston. After the coup, the major had been told that Alexander Kerensky had ordered the assassination of Richard Cameron as a first step in a plot to take over the Star League. But the Cryptia had only suspected his loyalty to the Empire was weak and so moved to eliminate Gerald in 2776. A successful guerrilla campaign alongside his loyal cadets led him to a confrontation with Colonel Marcus Berger, nephew to one of Amaris's chief advisors and one of the 2 surviving bodyguards, who had accompanied the Emperor to his fateful final meeting with the First Lord. Plagued by guilt at what he had witnessed, Berger provided McKinniston with a security recording from within the Royal Palace's throne room on the day of the coup, before taking his own life. The Major survived long enough to see the SLDF return to Terra, after which the information he possessed promptly made its way to the commanding general, proving beyond question Richard's ultimate fate.
The Northern Europe battle group had a large area to cover and many former nations to liberate. But at the start of the operation would focus on the major industrial sites at Berlin and the Ruhr conurbation, as well as the European Theatre Command headquarters within the Sandhurst Castle Bryan. 10th Army opted for 2 landing sites on either side of the German capital. Magdeburg was secured within just a few hours by the Erwin Rommel Division and 2 jump infantry divisions of 26th Corps, after which they spread out in all directions, liberating several towns in the first week. Meanwhile, 39th Corps moved from Seelow to Frankfurt an der Oder to the east of Berlin. Heading up the Spree River, they ran into their first real opposition. Germany was occupied by 3 hegemony Patriot divisions, the 2nd and 19th around Berlin, and the 10th far to the west. The former were one of the first of their kind, created shortly after the founding of the Empire. As such, they received the best training under the Hector Rowe Imperial Division, and were fiercely loyal to Amaris, having far fewer conscripts in their unit than their later counterparts. The 19th Hegemony Patriots, by comparison, were only weeks old and were about to have their first engagement, when on February 9th, Together as One reached Potsdam. The Green recruits held up well until the SLDF forded the lake and attacked from the rear. The unit surrendered by the end of the day. A fast flanking force moved around to the south to secure Schönefeld spaceport, while the rest headed through the Spandau district to take Tegel spaceport on the 11th. To the east of the city, back to the Stone Age was fought to a standstill by the 2nd Hegemony Patriots, but the Pride of Carrington were able to ford the Langer Sea on February 14th, racing to encircle the defenders. Only a last-second escape through Vogelsdorf allowed them to withdraw into the city. Another flanking attack across the Havel River into Grunewald Forest allowed them to bypass the defences within the western suburbs, but the city centre itself was heavily fortified. On the 20th, the Pride of Carrington crossed the canal to seize the ancient Tempelhof spaceport, cutting off the last avenue of escape. The SLDF began to tighten the noose 2 days later, prompting many defections and eventually a full mutiny against the Amaris general. The few survivors surrendered on February 28th. 15th Army had split its strength between Great Britain and the Low Countries. The latter task force of 3 divisions had 2 objectives. First, they took quick control of Amsterdam and Brussels to ensure those forces around the Ruhr didn't head west. The rest of the detachment moved along the coast and then through the Channel Tunnel to secure both ends of the vital continental link. The remaining 10 divisions would land in England. 15th Army's primary objective remained the capture of Sandhurst, but this was still months from completion. The Devils of Devil's Rock were landing 100 kilometers west to seize a biological weapons lab, while the Manteuffel Division took the important spaceports at Heathrow and Northolt. As the 326th approached London, they came under heavy fire from the Burning Tigers, the mercenary unit responsible for the mass slaughter of civilians on Helen. Now at divisional strength, the Mercs were working in tandem with the 17th Amaris Lancers. The regular army pushed ahead until they reached Gunnersbury, after which they established observation posts around the city to prevent a breakout, before waiting for reinforcements. The Geneva Battle Group was tasked with not just the capture of the Terran Hegemony Congress, but also the neighbouring French territories. France was the responsibility of 5th Army, who landed most of their forces southwest of Paris, with a pair of divisions further southeast at Mâcon. The Rigel Centaurus Division led the attack on the capital, which was defended by the 8th Hegemony Patriots. The St. Cyr Military Academy was the site of a lamentable engagement on February 2nd, when a battalion of teenage students loyal to Amaris fought to the bitter end. Versailles was liberated 2 days later. The SLDF continued along the southern edge of the city, and on February 7th secured Orly Spaceport. That same day, the Florida Swamp Foxes crossed the Seine River. The 150th and 197th began launching probes into the city proper, with infantry moving in to secure the 14th and 15th arrondissements in the days after. Meanwhile, the Carver Division was working its way through the southern expanse of the city, beyond the Peripherique. By the 15th, they had pushed up to Austerlitz station, securing the Ile de la Cité 4 days later. The Patriots had been pushed back into a pocket around the École Militaire, but as the New Orleans Division closed to finish them off, a tactical warhead detonated, almost destroying the Patriots and SLDF alike, along with a large chunk of central Paris. Lyon was relatively bloodless, as the garrison had withdrawn to Grenoble. There, they held back the superior numbers of the SLDF, who were forced to approach down the narrow valleys. A task force landed to the south of the city, surrounding the defenders, who were destroyed in the early morning hours of February 20th. The battle for the capital would conclude early the next month with the capture of Wassy Spaceport. Nearby, the lead army of the Geneva Battle Group was making their assault on the Terran Hegemony capital. Most of 18th Army had landed just south of the border, while a small task force landed further north along the shores of Lake Geneva. By February 2nd, they had spread out to secure the neighbouring towns. 2 other divisions did the same in France, while the Tobruk Division was leading the main assault force north across the border. The capital was one of the most heavily defended sites on Earth, with the 99th Amaris Dragoons, 2nd Tartan Brigade, and 13th Hegemony Patriots standing guard. The Northern Task Force was the first to be engaged at Versoix. By February 7th, the SLDF had pushed the Tartan Brigade back to Geneva Spaceport, but could progress no further on account of the heavily fortified facility. Around this time, the rest of the SLDF reached the southern expanse of the city, while artillery support provided by troops across the border at Jura finally broke the Tartan Brigade's defences, allowing the Flanders Division to take the spaceport for themselves. The Imperial unit withdrew back towards the Hegemony Congress, where the Patriots were busy fortifying the complex. By the 12th, the Dragoons had been pushed back across the Arve River. Fighting out of the Old Town, they held the Tobruk Division back until the regular army were able to secure a beachhead on February 19th. Fleeing north back across the Rhône, the Dragoons tried to block pursuit by destroying the bridges, but enough remained for the Stalag forces to give chase. With most of the city now secure, the 8 regular army divisions settled down for a long siege. Securing the Mediterranean was essential to cover the southern flank of operations in Europe and prevent Amaris troops based in Africa from heading north. On the Iberian Peninsula, 1st Army touched down at Avila. Most units headed towards the capital, but heavy winter snows slowed the infantry considerably. The Hannibal Division forged on ahead though. On February 5th, they entered the city, only to find it totally bereft of Imperial forces. They captured the Royal Palace in short order, and Madrid was declared liberated the next day. Partisans remained, which forced the SLDF to enact martial law for a time, but by the end of the month they had secured the entire peninsula and crossed over into France. A small detachment was also airlifted across the Mediterranean to secure the Gibraltar Strait. They would be the first to set foot in Africa during Operation Liberation. The second unit in the Southern Europe battle group was 6th Army, who landed just north of Naples. The situation in Italy had deteriorated into outright anarchy, perpetuated by General Antilos Lagos's Greenhaven Gestapo. They had spent the past decade ransacking the Italian peninsula, defacing many of the 3,000-year-old monuments. Bandits had de facto control of the region, the strongest of which were recruited into the Gestapo themselves, which had grown to divisional strength. Securing Naples fell to the colony commanders and Lightning Bees, a difficult task which they achieved with merit. They finally began to move out on February 27th. With the ground invasion of Earth well underway, Admiral Grech next turned his attention to the secondary targets within the Terran system. First on the list was Earth's moon. After the destruction of the SDS bases by SLM warships, the path was clear for Marines to descend in force on the major population centers. Lunar City housed the largest contingent of Imperial forces, 5,000 all told, but a brief 2-week campaign saw the moon secured by mid-February. The peculiarities of infantry combat in a pressurized environment forced the use of low lethality munitions, which ultimately kept the struggle a largely bloodless affair on both sides. Next were the terraformed terrestrial planets, Mars and Venus. Both housed military bases that at one time had formed the war triad alongside Sandhurst. They had been ruined by nuclear strikes during the coup, but there were almost 300 million civilians still living on the worlds. Landings on Mars began on February 9th at Olympus Mons and faced little opposition. The majority of the garrison had been withdrawn to Earth as soon as the SLDF had appeared in system. Now the civilians overthrew the Imperial government, and the planet was secure by March.
Mars had long been the playground of the ultra-rich. The low gravity allowed for architecture that would have been impossible on Earth, and vanity projects like kilometer-tall statues dotted the dusty landscape. Under the Amaris Empire, it became a major enclave for Stefan's supporters among the nobility, with the rest of the planet's population existing purely to cater to their every whim. In case that is lost on you, imagine a planet full of narcissistic yes-men. Ironically, sounds like Terra as well, but I digress. Governance of Mars fell to Duke Reginald Windsor Small V, a close political ally and descendant of the old British monarchy. Despite the close ties, Amaris was quick to recognize the planet as a lost cause once the Star League Navy appeared in system and extracted whatever forces he could for his own defense. Windsor Small was left hopelessly outgunned and was executed by the planet's underclass in a mass revolt. Mars became a major staging post and hospital site for the SLDF's continuing campaign on Terra, as well as being a jumping-off point for refugees fleeing the carnage.
Venus promised more of a challenge. As part of its terraforming procedures, the Department of Mega Engineering had constructed an enormous orbital sunshade, the largest man-made object in history. Amaris now hoped to employ this device as a weapon in Operation Icarus, but rushed miscalculations on the part of his officers resulted in the gravitational stresses tearing the sunshade apart. Nobody yet knew it, but through that error they had resigned Venus to a long, slow fate of environmental collapse, and today the world is all but abandoned. Also left in a dangerous, deteriorating orbit was Aphrodite Station. The sudden arrival of the SLN at a proximity point left the 24 docked Imperial warships scrambling into action. As they all disengaged from the station at once, the facility began tumbling towards the ground. A 7-hour engagement put an end to the last significant Amaris naval force, but when the Star League rushed to save Aphrodite Station, they were targeted by SDS batteries on Venus. The attacks soon stopped when Imperial forces on the ground stormed their bases and disarmed their colleagues. Their surrender allowed the orbital facility to be saved. Last on the list of targets for the Star League Navy were new shipyards from which to service their devastated fleet, which now contained many vessels too badly damaged to safely jump to more secure systems to undertake repairs. The swift capture of a handful of independent facilities within the Jovian Trojans, such as the Mercator Campion base at Andromach, went some way to accomplishing that need. The main goal was the colossal Titan shipyards, the largest commercial complex in existence. Taking it wouldn't be easy, as the station was rigged to explode if the occupants felt they were about to be overpowered. Instead, a pair of warships, the SLS Ocean and Unity City, jumped to the far side of Saturn, burned onto an intercept trajectory with Titan, and then shut down their vessels to mask their approach. After silently slingshotting their way around the gas giant, 6 boarding craft disembarked and made course corrections to bring them up to the shipyard. As they drew closer, the warships powered up, drawing all eyes towards them and creating an opening for the shuttles to land, after which the commandos on board secured the facility in just 15 minutes. The only situation that arose during this time was at the de facto Belter capital Metis. The massive asteroid had been hollowed out in the early days of space exploration, and more than 50,000 people now lived in the enormous 10-kilometer-long revolving habitat. Amaris security forces took the population hostage and threatened to detonate the entire facility. While Starleague negotiators kept them talking, a commando team was able to infiltrate the asteroid through old mining tunnels and eliminate the die-hard Amaris goons with only a handful of civilian casualties. 8th Army spent March pushing south through Honshu, psychologically preparing themselves for what lay ahead. 20th Army, meanwhile, faced a difficult crossing. For starters, they broke off a pair of divisions to take the Aquarius Arcology, a massive complex located on the inland sea. It took them a whole month to breach the compound, bypass the defensive drones, and secure the naval spaceport. The main battle was happening at Shimonoseki Crossing though. As it happened in the north, the tunnels had been destroyed, and the solitary bridge became the scene of intense fighting. Only when combat engineers reopened one of the tunnels on March 19th were the SLDF infantry able to flank the defenders and secure both sides of the bridge. The last of the chasseurs were destroyed 3 days later. Across the Sea of Japan, 16th Army completed the liberation of the Korean peninsula and began closing on Beijing. Their approach slowed to a crawl after running into a pair of AEAF divisions and more than 24 militia regiments. A concentrated effort over 9 days advanced them a mere 20 kilometers before they had to regroup. Further south, the 16th Hegemony Patriots were chased out of Bangkok on March 2nd and destroyed 10 days later. Far to the northwest, the Mongolian detachment of 2nd Army reached Irkutsk on March 5th. With that, the SLDF now had full control of the Trans-Siberian Maglev tracks. The southern detachment was moving through Tibet, liberating Lhasa on the 11th. Their battle group partner, 19th Army, was headed towards Xi'an. When they reached the outskirts of the city on March 19th, they were greeted by large crowds of civilians, but they were soon horrified to discover that many among them were wearing remote explosives. The 201st Amaris Lancers fully exploited all 8 million people within Xi'an during their defense of the city. Around 1/3 of the population was killed during the following weeks. The Lancers were finally forced out on April 9th, but rounded up 10,000 hostages before departing, which they herded along with them to prevent overhead warships from raining retribution on them. The SLDF was forced to break off pursuit and deal with the humanitarian crisis they had left behind. In India, 9th Army split itself in two. The Bryant Division led a charge against Agra, while the newly appointed Major General Lauren Hayes took command of the Ulysses S. Grant Division's assault on New Delhi. On March 10th, the 151st reached Gurgaon and entered into combat with the 29th Amaris Chasseurs. The engagement was short-lived, the Imperial forces soon withdrawing to the nearby spaceport in an attempt to flee. 2 of the 5 dropships were shot down by aerospace pilots, while the others were tracked to Isfahan, where they became 4th Army's problem. Unfortunately, the capture of the 2 cities did not bring peace, as both Haryana and Uttar Pradesh rose in rebellion against both the Empire and Starleague. The King Henry Division was leading 5 other divisions of 14th Army south through Gujarat, liberating Surat on March 9th and reaching the outskirts of Mumbai 2 days later. The 8th Amaris Dragoons held their ground along the Vaitarna River for a time before withdrawing back to Vasai Creek. The crossings along the eastern edge of the city were collapsed, forcing the SLDF to attack from the fortified north. The Dragoons managed to hold them there for 5 days before they were again forced to withdraw, this time heading towards the spaceport near Mahim Bay. Unfortunately for them, they never made it, as the city rose up in rebellion around them and executed their oppressors. Soon, most of India was engulfed in a civil war, save only for the northwest districts.
Despite centuries of development and prosperity under the Star League, the age-old imbalance between the haves and have-nots on Earth had never been addressed. It was a problem that had plagued the planet since the days of the Terran Alliance, when humanity was making its first tentative steps into space. Though nation-states had long since been done away with, the fact remained that those first colonies had the closest ties to the administrative districts of Europe and North America. What were most often the richest hegemony worlds continued to funnel wealth back to the countries that established them. For the less affluent regions, neither the Ameris Empire nor Star League had shown any likelihood of resolving the problem. When the Civil War reached their own homes, they saw both Stefan and Alexander as oppressors and took up arms against them. It's unclear whether Kerensky had naively failed to predict the rebellion or knew all along that there would be trouble and yet had little option but to press ahead regardless.
Fourth Army passed through Turkmenistan in early March, then split in two. The Ricochet Rabbits and Red Diamond Division advanced into Iran, taking Tehran on March 8th, and then dispatched the recently arrived 29th Amaris Chasseurs 3 days later. They continued west through Baghdad and Damascus, reaching the Mediterranean on April 2nd. The other half raced onwards into Afghanistan, taking Kabul on the 24th. By the end of the month, they had crossed the border again and liberated Islamabad. St. Petersburg was liberated on March 17th, with the last holdouts in northwest Russia falling to 11th Army in the following weeks, while another detachment advanced into Poland. To the south, the 17th completed their liberation of Ukraine. Only the Castle Bryan still stood, but with the occupants surrounded and warships overhead, they could retask divisions with new objectives for the following months. Germany was likewise mostly in SLDF hands by the end of March, save for a collection of towns in the east held by the 10th Hegemony Patriots. The 75th Light Horse managed to liberate 3 cities in southern Germany entirely by themselves. The largest obstacle they faced came at an airfield outside Munich, where a pair of experimental super heavy Berk 2s laid waste to the approaching Light Horse until they ran out of ammo. Across the Channel, orbital bombardment at the Sandhurst Castle Bryan by SLS Wellesley had rendered the facility largely inoperable. On March 11th, a Special Forces team infiltrated the complex through narrow wiring conduits, allowing 15th Army to take control of the outermost level of the complex, with 3 further rings of defences still to go. The assault on London remained on hold until the situation at Sandhurst was resolved, but the Calais detachment took Gatwick and then set up positions in the east of the city at Queen Elizabeth II Park. The Manteuffel Division likewise reinforced their position at Ealing Common. Throughout March, 5th Army completed the liberation of France, but it was a campaign that would cost them dearly. A full third of the unit would be listed as casualties, which was crippling to morale. The Iberian Peninsula was similarly pacified, but with little actual fighting. It was suspected that the Imperial unit defending the region had never left, but simply abandoned their posts and fled as small groups into the countryside. In early March, 6th Army was making swift northward progress when they came under fire from chemical weapons launched from the Ferentino Hills. The effects were devastating, and the Stalag Navy quickly sought retribution. The Greenhaven Gestapo withdrew into the capital, taking up positions within hospitals and schools to dissuade further use of orbital weapons. Precision strikes were still made when possible. On March 9th, the SLDF reached the city outskirts, taking the spaceport to prevent the mercs from escaping. Fighting within the city was intense, but mercifully brief, the Greenhaven Gestapo again withdrawing north on March 19th. By this point, military intelligence had confirmed that General Antilos Legos was with his unit, which was now less than a regiment in strength. the Amaris Empire Strategic Operations Director had been the mastermind behind some of the worst atrocities unleashed on the SLDF and the hegemony during Operation Chieftain. His capture was a priority. The mercs were finally cornered at Ferrara, whereupon they turned and surrendered. There is some controversy over what happened next. Some say that there were mass executions, others simply that the surrender was refused after similar attempts in Rome resulted in the detonation of suicide vests. Ultimately, the unit was wiped out to a man, and Legos's body could never be identified. The first 3 months of Operation Liberation had been a tremendous success for the SLDF. They had survived the flight through the system and the perilous landings with far fewer casualties than they had feared, though the numbers of dead were still sobering. They had freed huge areas of Eurasia from the oppressive Amaris rule, and were now moving into the secondary administrative districts to complete the liberation of the continent. Most of their armies had linked up, creating a near unbroken chain from coast to coast. Their arrival had marked the death knell for the faltering Star League economy. It had never recovered from the coup, but had managed to just barely stay afloat. The disruption of all-out war on Earth led to an inevitable and terminal collapse. That same fate felt imminent for the Empire as a whole. Mercenaries in particular, with no links to Amaris other than the obscene riches they had won or stolen in his employ, were running for cover. One of the worst, Darabont's Damned, lifted off Zolokofan and disappeared out into the periphery. Several major hurdles still stood ahead of the Star League Defence Force. Only one of the 8 castles Brian had been taken. The Terran Congress at Geneva was holding out, and going into April, the SLDF now faced the daunting challenge of liberating 3 major capitals, Beijing, London, and Tokyo. The latter was the most populated city in human history, with upper estimates of around 50 million inhabitants within the 14,000 square kilometers. On April 2nd, 8th Army reached the outskirts. Holding the Japanese capital were the 71st Amaris Dragoons and the 197th Amaris Cavaliers. Their first encounter came when the Dragoons disrupted an attempted river crossing at Sakai, and then continued to pressure them as they advanced from the north. An SLDF detachment was sent on a wide flanking route east towards Tokyo Bay, capturing the spaceport at Narita on April 19th. Fear of encirclement forced the Dragoons to withdraw back to the city centre, and 4 days later, 8th Army had reformed at the Arakawa River.
During the Amaris coup, the Terran militia had largely stood apart from the fighting. Their loyalties lay with their home administrative districts, not with the Greater Star League or ruling House Cameron. While this remained true within the Empire, Amaris propaganda had portrayed Kerensky and his SLDF as baby killers come to enslave the people of Earth and restore the vile despot Cameron. Upon their arrival, the response by militia was mixed. Several took up arms and fought alongside the Imperial forces, whereas others surrendered at the first opportunity or declared their neutrality. At best, they helped to restore order after the regular army had crushed the AEAF. The fiercest resistance was found within western China. At Harbin, militia detonated a nuclear bomb to deny the 13th Army control of the spaceport, then tried to do the same within the city as they fled. The Beijing defenders were by far the most numerous. They outnumbered the 2 Amaris divisions and even the approaching 16th Army. The SLDF was fought to a near standstill by the militia as they closed on the city, providing them with one of their greatest challenges of the campaign.
Beijing had 2 AEAF divisions, the 8th Amaris Fusiliers and 3rd Hegemony Patriots, but also dozens of Chinese militia regiments. The 7 SLDF divisions, all suffering from more than a decade of campaigning, could only just match those numbers. Their efforts so far had achieved only the capture of Tianjin on April 6th. Soon after, reinforcements from 13th Army arrived, giving the SLDF the clear numbers advantage they needed. By the 15th, they had taken the spaceport and eastern reaches of the city, then broke through to the city centre 4 days later. The Imperial troops withdrew west, with the King's Own jump troops in hot pursuit. However, after almost catching their prey, the trail suddenly went cold. Only later was the secret entrance to the Tien Shan Castle Brian discovered. Warships maneuvered overhead to ensure that nobody left the facility, while 16th Army returned to liberating the eastern Chinese administrative districts. In Europe, 6th Army completed their liberation of northern Italy. 10th Army did the same in eastern Germany, but not before the 10th Hegemony Patriots managed to withdraw back into the Bochum Castle Bryan. The rest of the European battle groups began preparations for their next objectives in Central Europe and the Balkans. At London, the Burning Tigers were growing increasingly worried about their encircled position and attempted a breakout on April 15th. Crossing at Battersea, they headed southwest along the tracks until they were intercepted at Kingston upon Thames, after which they staged a fighting retreat through Richmond Park, back across Putney Bridge, surrendering control of South London to the SLDF. May would see the end of several of the few remaining concentrations of Amaris troops. After their first crossing of the Arakawa River was repulsed by the Amaris Cavaliers, the SLDF instead launched another wide flanking attack, which completed its encirclement on May 3rd, when they reached Kawasaki. While a small detachment secured the southern city, the rest of 8th Army began to close in from all sides. Meanwhile, 20th Army successfully liberated the major cities in southern Honshu. A hard push through Shinanomachi on May 27th successfully split and isolated the defenders, with the dragoons at Shibuya and the cavaliers at Chiyoda. The latter now took up residence at the ancient imperial palace, taking Duke Naruhito and his family hostage. They demanded safe passage to leave the city, or else they would execute the Duke. Kerensky was notified of the situation, but decided that he could not allow the cavaliers to escape. His refusal brought about immediate reprisals, which included the murder of Naruhito's teenage daughter. On June 2nd, a commando team breached the palace, killing the division's command staff. The rest of the unit surrendered the next day. The dragoons attempted to flee north, but were caught before they reached the river. On May 2nd, the Pride of Puget Sound and Wellington Division crossed the Himalayas into Nepal. They were approaching the Kathmandu Castle Bryan, garrisoned by the 2nd Amaris Fusiliers. The fortifications had taken more than a year for the Imperial troops to breach during the Amaris coup, and now the SLDF faced the same problem. They would need to wait for reinforcements from the India Battle Group before beginning their assault. Meanwhile, the Northern Asia Battle Group continued south along the Yellow Sea, taking Shanghai on May 29th. London was one of the last objectives in Western Europe. The mercenaries' willingness to abandon the city, which was the heart of pro-Amaris control within the British Isles, had caused internal strife between the two defending divisions. On May 2nd, the building pressure ignited, with spontaneous fighting breaking out between regulars and mercenaries all across the city centre. The Manteuffel division was content to sit back and watch their opponents wear each other out, moving in to disarm the exhausted survivors 3 days later. A few small units broke and ran. The remaining lancers were caught by the 326th at Elephant and Castle, while the last of the Burning Tigers fled their command post at Highbury Stadium and made it to Highgate Wood before their eventual destruction. The Bochum Castle Bryan became the second to fall to the SLDF after a 3-week battle left almost the entire Hegemony Patriot Division dead. 10th Army's southern detachment also crossed the border into western Austria. Around the same time, the last defenders at Sandhurst were finally overrun after a near continual battle for 3.5 months. Unfortunately for the SLDF, General Gunther Julian had ample time to wipe the base's memory core, destroying any documents that would aid Kerensky, and then took his own life. More than 50,000 were killed fighting within this one Castle Bryan. The situation at Geneva had taken a turn against the defenders, who had run out of food in late April. The SLDF was offering rations to any soldiers who surrendered, with several individuals and small groups taking them up on the offer. However, the Stalag soldiers had grown fearful of pressing ahead, as rumours were circulating that the defenders had access to a terrifying experimental new battle mech, which had already claimed several kills. A patrol was tasked with rooting out whatever was still lurking in the city, only to stumble into a well-prepared ambush site. The 90-ton prototype Rifleman 3 burst from concealment and obliterated the unit commander with a full alpha from its quartet of Gauss rifles. It continued to pick off mechs from the company, periodically withdrawing to refill its limited ammo reserves, until only 3 were left standing. They finally caught it rearming and were able to detonate the ammo truck, catching the Rifleman 3 in the blast, putting it down for good. By early June, the trickle had become a flood. The dwindling forces attempted to break out, but were caught by a pair of 18th Army independent regiments at the border. The last holdouts within the Terran Congress surrendered on June 10th. Later that month, an SLDF checkpoint picked up an individual trying to board a civilian dropship heading out of the system. It didn't take long for them to see through his false identity, and they discovered him to be none other than the Amaris Empire Minister of Communications, Samir Injari. The head of the Cryptia was taken into custody. Later in 2777, 3rd Army redeployed from the cold climate of western Siberia to the scorching deserts of the Middle East. The India battle group arrived at Kathmandu on June 17th, and in conjunction with 2nd Army, the SLDF forced its way inside to take control the next month. After that, the 9th and 14th returned to India, which was still in open rebellion. It took 4 months for 16th Army to clear out the Tien Shan complex. Thousands were wounded by the Imperial divisions, who fought to the bitter end. Niigata was the penultimate target to be liberated by 8th Army in early July. The Japan battle group now closed from both sides on the Takayama Castle Bryan. Inside were the 8th Amaris Legionnaires and the Warriors of Dawn mercenary unit. Both were experienced units that would not make life easy for the SLDF. Eleventh Army continued to work with the Kiev detachment as they pushed west into Hungary and Romania. Both were hotbeds of Amaris supporters, and restoring order proved almost impossible. The 2nd Detachment of 17th Army liberated Istanbul on July 11th, then took Sofia 1 week later. 10th Army was advancing in 2 different directions. Vienna fell on June 25th, then Czechia and Slovakia the following month. The other detachment liberated Copenhagen on July 7th, then crossed the Øresund Bridge into Scandinavia. The rest of the Northern Europe battle group joined them early the next month, after taking Ireland in July. The Geneva and Southern Europe battle groups joined forces and began preparing for the first stages of the African campaign. The various Mediterranean islands were taken throughout July and August, and they began launching aerial reconnaissance raids over the southern continent, and even some across the Atlantic. The 1st and 7th Elysian Rangers, which had accompanied the SLDF to Earth, were distressed to find that their home base in Sicily had been ruined. Sadly, neither would survive to the end of the campaign. Later in August, 17th Army also reached Athens, the last European city to be liberated. The depredations of the 201st Amaris Lancers, the unit responsible for the massacre at Xi'an, continued throughout the rest of 2777. The Stalag Navy's difficult decision not to sacrifice the hostages had created a situation where most of the Chinese districts had joined India in open revolt. Only the final destruction of the Lancers at Wuhan in November brought about an end to the rebellion, and India was mollified early the next year.
The Battle for Terra was unquestionably a violent affair that resulted in the deaths of millions of civilians, on top of the military casualties. That said, it was comparatively clean compared to some of the other planets targeted in Operation Chieftain. Scorched earth tactics were seldom employed, and the Empire was particularly reserved in their deployment of WMDs. Kerensky, of course, had completely forbidden their use outside of precision orbital strikes from overhead warships. The worst atrocities that took place happened in China, where the 201st Amaris Lancers committed abhorrent acts, like forcing refugees to detonate hidden explosive charges after they made contact with the SLDF troops, or even strapping civilians to their mechs to deter Kerensky's forces from firing on them. Dealing with this barbarity fell to the 19th Army. At the forefront of their advance was Major General John Fletcher, and the liberators of Java, who handled the difficult task with merit. Even after hunting down these perpetrators, they were left with a humanitarian crisis and a region that rose in revolt. The China battle group spent the next 2 years on pacification duty, recuperating from the brutality that they'd witnessed, and in some cases had been forced to deal out themselves.
The 11-month siege of the Sverdlovsk Castle Bryan came to an end on January 19th. Takayama became the last Castle Bryan to fall later that summer, when the Warriors of Dawn were able to negotiate a deal with the SLDF that would allow the unit to leave Earth. Throughout Operation Chieftain, no member of the Stalag Navy had distinguished themselves as much as Admiral Marina Akayev-Cameron. Her anti-SDS tactics had saved the lives of many within the SLDF. It's no surprise that Admiral Grech turned to her to sweep up the last of the systems that had been bypassed on the way to Terra. With the fleets repaired and refitted, Akayev-Cameron targeted first the largest drone fleet at Thorin in November 2777. The remnants of her 4th Fleet, now again employing the Project Night Jammers to good effect, next moved to Zolokothin in January, Terra Firma followed in March, and lastly Epsilon Indi in July. Unfortunately, those behind the planning of this side campaign had made a terrible oversight. Kerensky had not spared any of the regular army, instead being content to blockade the Imperial troops on those planets. When the civilians unexpectedly took to the street in protest of the Amaris government, they faced brutal reprisals from the HSF and OPD. The Navy in orbit was powerless to lend any assistance while the garrison forces remained within the cities. Hegemony citizens bore the brunt of their rage and frustration, something which would come back to haunt the Stali. With the Eurasian campaign winding down in 2778, High Command began looking towards their next targets. Among the casualties of Operation Liberation so far were more than 1 million civilians and almost 100,000 from the SLDF, some 30% of the regular army in total. 2 divisions had been destroyed by nuclear detonations, and a further 11 had been disbanded. Penciled in for that summer was the simultaneous invasion of Africa and South America, isolating Stefan Amaris on the North American continent. Each had a trio of functional Castles Bryan, but apart from a few divisions sent across to secure the Straits of Gibraltar, the Stalik had no presence on either landmass so far. Lieutenant General Antonio Solman, who had nearly been killed at his Brazilian residence by an assassination team during the coup, was tasked with drawing up the invasion plan for his home continent. As the difficulties in pacifying China and India continued, Kerensky realized that he could not become bogged down in similar campaigns in the southern hemisphere. Instead, they would use what strength they had left for a final push towards Unity City. Some Imperial units could see the writing on the wall either way, and took the opportunity to flee the planet. Few made it through the blockade, but the 141st Amaris Dragoons were one of the lucky ones. Preparations for the Africa assault continued along the Mediterranean, but this was an SLDF counterintelligence operation to mislead the Empire. The real goal was reaching North America. Earlier in the campaign, the Empire had collapsed the transoceanic tunnels that once ran below the Bering Strait and had even connected Europe through Iceland. Furthermore, defensive installations along the Pacific Wall had been fortified to the point where an amphibious landing would be disastrous. With the American SDS batteries intact, orbital maneuvers were out of the question too. That left them 2 approaches. The first was to use low-flying aerodyne dropships such as the Leopard class to skim the surface of the ocean and touch down in Alaska. Beginning in October 2778, the Eastern Europe and Northern Asia battle groups relocated to Chukotka and began training in the Siberian wilderness for the upcoming assault. The second approach was through a narrow corridor over the ocean that would take them to Mexico. The India battle group was selected for this operation. Their route would bring them into range of the Indonesian, Australian and Pacific arrays, and so a supporting campaign pushing south from Asia would clear a path. The Japan battle group relocated to Taiwan and was reinforced by the Malaysia battle group, together taking on responsibility for the Pacific. The Central Asia battle group relocated to India and prepared for their assault on Australia. The attacks were scheduled for January 7th. Before the next phase of Operation Liberation could begin, the SLDF undertook a number of preliminary actions. In November, pathfinders were dispatched to the new continents to identify and mark the best landing sites, while commando teams were tasked with the destruction of the many STS batteries. Several major Indonesian ports were captured in December ahead of the main force's arrival. Things almost went wrong on New Year's Day when a commando team was discovered by the HSF in Mexico, but mass aerial raids over Africa and Southern America meant the HSF report was overlooked. On January 3rd, 2 regiments of the Filtwelt Fusiliers made landfall in Western Australia, heading for the Hammersley SDS arrays. 5 of the installations were captured, while the last 2 were bombarded from orbit. The unit's other 2 regiments landed on the beaches surrounding Perth. They would secure the city on January 7th, moments before the rest of 69th Corps was set to arrive. The Pacific Battle Group departed from their bases late in the night on January 4th. They were supported in their actions by the vast majority of the available Cam Marine regiments, who were best equipped for the terrain. Southeast Asia had a minimum of defenders, but it still proved a costly campaign for the SLDF. 5 transports were destroyed crossing the South China Sea, and the defenders of Io suffered a nuclear strike in the Java Sea. The next morning, the 3 armies made simultaneous landfall across the major islands of Indonesia and the Philippines. 20th faced only a single regiment of defenders, but taking the 3 arrays proved costly as they had to contend with several hostage situations. The Western Islands had 6 battalions of mixed mercenary and hegemony patriot forces, who made full use of ambushes and booby traps to inflict heavy casualties around Lake Laut Tawa. Borneo had the strongest defence in the form of Cutlass Vagabonds, who again used human shields to prevent their destruction and demoralise the SLDF. Commando teams were used to secure the Indonesian STSs where possible, which helped keep civilian casualties to a minimum. In the 48 hours before the invasion of North America was set to begin, 4 Central American STSs were destroyed, clearing a path for 2 divisions of the Mexico battle group to make the crossing. The Australia and Mexico battle groups commenced their attack on the 7th as planned, but on account of extreme weather in Alaska, Operation Anchorhead was postponed until a safe crossing could be attempted. In southern Mexico, the Marne and Ulysses S. Grant divisions risked drops amid the still functioning STS batteries, while the majority of 9th Army landed at safer Acapulco. Almost a full brigade was lost in the approach, but it allowed the SLDF to quickly eliminate the remaining installations and establish air superiority. The 9th dropships now transported the rest of the army to their targets.
Mexico was one of the regions that had been particularly hard hit by Richard Cameron's disastrous rule. Amaris had found